Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's hearing, and we're going to hear any moment now from Mr. Rowe.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman.
Welcome. Good morning, Mr. Rowe. Morning, Mr. Rowe.
Morning, sir. Morning, sir.
Morning, Mr. Rowe. Before I do, Mr. Chairman, can I just make a housekeeping or timetabling point?
Yes.
To you, sir, Mr. Chairman, which I think other members of the public don't know yet. At the moment, in our schedule for today, we have Watch Manager Kentfield.
Yes.
And he was scheduled to come to give evidence this afternoon. At just after the end of hearing yesterday, we received from the Metropolitan Police a statement from him running to some 21 or so pages, very recently signed, which we have yet to study in detail. And it has not been disclosed, and it would need to go through the redactions and disclosure process before it were disclosed. In the light of that, it would be unfair to everybody, I think, including Mr. Kentfield, to be called to give evidence this afternoon when his evidence would be based only on his contemporaneous note. Yeah. In those circumstances, we have taken the steps with the LFB to postpone his evidence to a date to be fixed, as it were, pending detailed consideration of his statement and its disclosure to all CPs so that they can consider it as well. And we will update you and the public in due course on whether, and if so, when we intend to call him. It may well be that all the questions that we had for him are answered by his statement. So that's the position with Mr. Kentfield, which means that
well, thank you for drawing everyone's attention to that. It's regrettable that we can't take his evidence today, and I'm sorry about that, particularly because it's another disruption to the LFB's arrangements, but yes. We really have no option.
Yes, I agree. Thank you.
But so thank you for telling us, yes.
There we are. Mr. Rowe, well, good morning.
Morning, sir.
Can I ask you to revisit with me a topic very briefly that we discussed yesterday? Were you aware at any time of a pilot exercise developed by a watch manager called Peter Johnson, who was on the command unit team, which demonstrated the operational difficulties that crews would run into once FSG numbers got up to 7 or so?
No, I wasn't aware of that.
You weren't? Were you aware that a watch manager had developed an exercise, a training exercise of that kind, which was deemed not necessary or relevant by senior members of the LFB?
No, I wasn't aware of that.
Right. Now, can I then turn to the topic of stay put? If you go to your row log, which is MET quadruple 05404, and turn to the first page of that, please. We can see that at 247, the very first entry on the log, we see AC Row takes over and receives handover from DAC O'Loughlin. AC Row records decision to deviate from FSG advice being delivered to FSG callers by control staff and advise people to make efforts to leave the building. Fire sector is briefed to that effect. Now, in your statement, you say, and I can ask you to look at page 4 of that, in the penultimate paragraph, at 0247 hours, I asked CU. This is page 4 of your first statement. I think we're on the second statement.
Yeah, apologies, I can't.
No, you've been given the wrong statement. This is the second statement. I want the first statement, page 4, there. Now, yes. At 247, this is the penultimate paragraph, you say, I asked the CU to contact control and ask them to stop giving stay-put advice if they still were. This was based on the fire spread in the building and the number of persons trapped. At the same time, control asked for the same thing. I agreed and asked them to now advise people to make best efforts to escape.
Yes. So when I got
well,
to
can I just, sorry,
apologies.
I'm just showing you that so you know what's recorded about this decision. Now, I don't know if you've been following the inquiry, but we've heard evidence from DAC O'Loughlin that he was the one who was told by control that the stay put advice had been changed at control by Joe Smith and Adrian Fenton, and he told you that the decision had been taken when you arrived on the command unit. Is that your recollection, or is your recollection something different?
My recollection is something different, but that's not to say that Andy didn't say that. You know, at the end of the day, I was in charge of the incident for a long time, and there were many interactions with Andy, but I don't remember that. What I remember is thinking very clearly as I got onto the unit that I wanted to end stay put. I had a brief conversation with Nick Thatcher in the first instance about the civil disorder situation. That was the first conversation I had. He was the acting MPS inspector. I then turned to Jackie McConaughey, and although speaking to her, basically informed the entire command unit that I was taking over because I wanted to take that responsibility from Andy, and I wanted that logged, and that she was to be my logist, and then said the first decision I wanted recorded was that I wanted to end stay put advice. I then turned to the command unit staff to then give them that same instruction to make contact with control, and oddly found I didn't have to because the control were on the phone, and I don't know what command unit officer it was. I don't know their name. I can't remember their name. All I can tell you is that he was a white middle-aged man, bald, because I couldn't see it in my head. It may well be. It may well have been Pete Johnson. Turned across to me and said,
"Sorry, we're supposed to hear that. That was under my breath to
Sorry,
Mr. Kinnear, but that would be my next question."
Johnson. He turned to me, holding the phone, and said, "Control are on the phone, asking to end stay put advice. What do you want to do?" And I said, "Well, I want to end it anyway, so you can tell them yes. And I think we should be advising people they need to make their best efforts to escape." Right.
Now, neither Joe Smith nor DAC Fenton recall that they asked for permission to change the advice, and they said they made the decision themselves within the control room and were simply communicating that decision to the incident ground.
That may well have been the case, but
Right.
what was communicated to me, bearing in mind I didn't have direct conversation with either Joe or Adrian about this, was that they were asking, and I just said yes.
I see.
Because that concurred with my own assessment of what was occurring at the incident.
I see. So when in the log we see that you record the decision to deviate, do we read that as a decision made by the control room with which you were agreeing, or your decision as incident commander?
I would hold that as my decision because I had determined I was going to make that decision before I'd stepped onto the unit.
Right.
I think what it shows is that there was a kind of a triangulation in terms of my own assessment of the incident and obviously what had occurred in control. I wasn't aware, as you've just explained to me, that control had taken that decision earlier. That hadn't been communicated to me. I had no awareness of that. As far as I was concerned, I'd come to that assessment on the basis of what I'd heard in control, what I'd seen as regards the tower itself, and the viability of the advice that we would have been given as regards stay put, considering the conditions of the building.
Right.
And then, having got onto the unit, found, in that moment that obviously they had come to the same conclusion. Andy may well have briefed me to that effect afterwards, but I don't remember it.
Do you remember investigating with, or through Peter Johnson, whoever it was, with control, what were the factors which went into making that decision?
No. And actually, at that point in the incident, that wasn't my priority because I was very clear about what, and that's why I think it's important I own it as my decision, is the sense that I was there, I had some situational awareness, I saw how the tower was behaving. I knew that although that was a difficult decision, and it's not a straightforward decision to end stay put, it isn't going to guarantee necessarily that, a greater level of survivability for those poor people who are trapped inside the tower. But what I was very clear about, it was no longer valid advice. It was not something we could reasonably give people because actually all of the safeguards that building regulation would normally give you had been stripped away, and therefore we shouldn't be advising people in that regard. So that was where my decision lay, and what I saw on the incident ground did not permit me to allow that to continue because it just wasn't correct.
No. Did you get any sense, though, when you arrived on the command unit and the decision was made, that the decision had not only previously been made sometime before that, but was now being acted on by the control room?
No.
Right.
I didn't.
You didn't.
But at that point, obviously, what I'd done is walked via the tower, had a snapshot of how the fire survival guidance sector was being run from Tom Goodall. So it's all happened quite quickly, sequentially. You know, I'm starting to form an opinion in my own mind using the decision-making model about what my priorities were, my primary objectives, and how I was going to deliver activity to meet those objectives.
Right.
So I was very fixated on my own needs to establish a structure to meet those priorities. And actually that, you know, once I'd come to the decision that that was the right decision, I didn't necessarily need to dissect that in depth. There was too much dynamic on the incident ground to do that. And in particular, I was very concerned about the civil disorder, potential for civil disorder.
Right. Okay.
That was actually my priority, getting on the back of the unit. I felt that at the point we were at, you know, yes, stay put was extremely important. That was the first decision I wanted to make. But actually, at an even more basic level, I needed someone to regain control of the incident ground as a whole. I needed better cordons in place. I needed my people given the space to operate without facing the moral pressure, completely understandably, from the families and community that were there, faced with this, you know, awful sight. But actually, I really did need that space. That was my greatest concern. My feeling was that I wouldn't be able to get the numbers of people into the block that I wanted from the fire service if we didn't create some space at the base of the tower. And I was worried actually about the safety of residents and members of the community who I felt were on the edge of almost taking matters into their own hands to go back into the tower. There was almost that sense from the conversations, you know, that people had attempted to have with me on the way. That was actually my priority, which is why the first thing I said to anyone when seeing the police officer, Nick Thatcher, when I got on the unit, was actually expressing to him my concern about that and a desire that he called in extra resources to take control of the situation, which, to their credit, they did. And in fact, I think I specifically asked for the territorial support group, so the, you know, police who specialise in managing civil disorder, and they turned out to be very, very useful.
Right.
In a different context later in the incident.
Right. Now, going back to, if I can we focus on the change in the stay put advice recorded in your log? I just want to keep this as tight as possible to that issue. Regardless of who made the decision and whether they were separate decisions or when, what advice did you think should now be given to people who are still in the building?
I think that is extremely difficult. I think the advice would be an honest one, which would be that the conditions inside the building were such that we could no longer guarantee the integrity of the compartmentation that was going to protect them, and therefore they almost had to take their own judgment as to what was going to place them at greater risk. So actually, I would have expected control operators, you know, if there had been less calls, by the way, to perhaps interrogate a caller about the nature of the conditions in their flat, what kind of risk was posed to them, and then perhaps help them come to that decision themselves. Because actually, my sense was that conditions could have been so variable inside the tower that some people might have continued to be safer staying put. Other people would have benefited from leaving the flats. There was every possibility, actually, from what I'd seen, even briefly coming past the tower, that the lobby was compromised. So it wasn't necessarily that we were putting people into a hugely safer environment by suggesting they could leave the flat than they were in the flat. To be honest with you, it was like a devil's choice. I think people were just in a terrible place where the whole of the building had failed, but what we couldn't do was reasonably suggest that they were safe staying put. So I think it would have been about a discussion about their individual circumstances, trying to gauge whether we were going to get to them in time, which again I think would have been almost impossible in the context of the volume of calls coming in. And we talked about the difficulties of feedback, that feedback loop yesterday. So I think actually control operators were themselves in an almost impossible position in terms of managing the volume of calls, trying to judge a distant situation, having recognised themselves and from the incident ground that stay put was no longer valid. Actually, I think we were in the realms of something we hadn't encountered before, either on that scale or of that nature.
What did you expect, or at least hope, would change for the better, or perhaps not change for the worse, as a result of the change to the stay put advice, or the advice that you were giving to, or wanted to give to FSG callers?
I hoped that for some residents in the building, it would give them the opportunity to escape via the lobby whilst they still had a chance to do so. But I would caveat that by saying that I was under no illusions, absolutely no illusions, that we were at a stage of that incident at the point I took over, that anyone inside that building, including my own firefighters, were at great peril. That it wouldn't have mattered where you were in the building above that 4th floor, you were in great danger, because there was no way we could guarantee control of fire spread. The level of fire, it was like a firestorm, is the only way I can describe it. The level of fire spread, lateral, horizontally, vertically, downwards, was to such an extreme that I think it would have become very difficult to provide good advice to callers in particular, because whilst they might have been able to describe the circumstances of fire spread in their own flat, what they wouldn't have an awareness of is the conditions if they were worsening immediately outside the flat or maybe 2 floors below. So we've heard evidence of floors above the fire being in a better state than ones below, and then yet another floor above being in a worse state. That's very unusual to have that inconsistency between different floors, because the fire is spreading in such an unpredictable and wild manner, whether through voids or just through the ferocity of the fire itself. So I think they were in an extremely difficult position, the control operators.
Can I ask you to look, please, at the control debrief, which is LFB quadruple 03113. And go, please, to page 6 in that. This is a PRC review for the control room, I should just tell you, and these are also manuscript notes of a meeting which was held on the 24th of July 2017. Joe Smith was present at it, as well as a number of other control room officers. And if you go to page 6, at 2:35, stay put advice changed. Info from incident ground to Ort and to see you via station manager Olif. DAC Fenton views news on TV and BCC. Joe Smith aware of Lacknell House 1 hour. Joe Smith listening to Stratford control room and forming an opinion. DAC Fenton wants to check with Fireground. Joe Smith makes decision and tells Alex Norman advice, and here it is, to wet towels over mouth, hold hands, stay together, get out, could be last chance. Now, first question is, going back to the topic we looked at a minute ago, were you aware that that advice had been given and was being given from 2:35?
No, I wasn't, and I wasn't aware of the level of detail that was being given in terms of that advice.
Right. So, in terms of the detail of that advice, get out, could be last chance. When you advised, as we see in the log, that people make efforts to leave the building, would that be similar to or consistent with the advice that Joe Smith was telling her control room operators to give?
I think Joe's given some excellent guidance there. Right. I think that's about as good advice as you can give, actually. No, I mean, whether that would have necessarily protected people in the circumstances they found themselves, no.
Right.
But actually, in terms of the best advice a control operator could give, I think that's excellent advice.
Right. Let me just ask you this. Did you go about, even briefly, an exercise of balancing the risk of leaving the caller in a flat which may become affected by smoke or fire or heat, on the one hand, with, on the other, the risks inherent in taking them through a smoke-logged exit route?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that question?
Yeah. Did you balance the two risks, one against the other, leaving the caller in a flat which may become smoke-affected or heat-affected or fire-affected, on the one hand, with, on the other hand, the risks inherent in taking them through a smoke-logged exit route?
Yes. So that was the thought process I'd gone through as I walked from the base of the tower, and I did grapple with that, because it's not a straightforward decision. But what drove me to my final decision was a sense that internal compartmentation had failed to such an extent I couldn't see any flat ultimately in that building remaining as a survivable environment. Because I couldn't gauge fully the extent to which that would happen, so the timescales within that would happen, bearing in mind that what I had seen was that every flat I could see was fully involved, vented, fire inside it. I felt I had to take a decision on the bigger picture, because I suppose, again, that's what I'm there for in my role. And I didn't think it was manageable, actually, because of the volume of calls, to try and dissect it into individual flats at that moment. I was thinking, I guess, about the broader picture and as many people as we could save as possible.
Right. Did you ask DAC O'Loughlin at any time, at this time, during his briefing or at the moment you made your decision that the advice should be changed, as to why he hadn't taken the decision to depart from stay put already?
No, because it wouldn't have affected the progress of the incident moving forward. I think it would have been unhelpful to Andy to do that. I wasn't there at the point where he may or may not have made that decision. I wasn't aware of the conditions in the tower at the point he was there and may or may not have made that decision. So, to be honest with you, it didn't even cross my mind, because I had what I had. I had a job to do, turning up there, taking over, setting priorities, setting activity to meet those priorities. Actually, it was fairly pointless to go back and dissect at that point why a decision had or hadn't been made. I was just clear in my own decision, and I knew what I needed to do to push activity forward. Yeah. So I just don't think it would have been helpful at that point. And also, I needed Andy to do a job for me. Andy had absorbed massive pressure for a period of time as incident commander, but I still needed him to go out with confidence, with my trust, to handle a really difficult job, maintaining momentum tactically against my objectives.
He had been there on the incident ground for some 45 to 50 minutes, in fact almost an hour before you had, and had been incident commander for some 45 minutes or so before you took over. Were you not interested to know, as part of your own assessment of this risk, why he hadn't made the decision that you were about to make?
No, because I think what I was presented with was so stark that actually, from my perspective, I was very clear about my decision. That what may have happened before, actually it could have been entirely different an hour before. The conditions inside the building could have been entirely different an hour before, or even actually looking at the fire and the way the fire was spreading before my eyes, very different quarter of an hour before. In some ways, it would have been almost irrelevant to dissect that. What I saw was what I saw. The information I'd been getting from control kind of verified my own feelings in terms of the volume of FSG calls. So genuinely, I just wouldn't have needed to dissect that piece of decision making at that point. I think it's entirely appropriate that the inquiry does. I think it's entirely appropriate that our PRC did, because it's important to learn why people make decisions, to take learning forward. But at that point in time, in the dynamic of that incident, with a job to do, and needing to maintain the confidence of Andy in himself, and to maintain, a view that I trusted him and I needed him to get out there and do a job, I think it would have been unhelpful for him, because it's such a big decision with such obvious ramifications that actually I'm not sure it would have been helpful in the context of incident command at that point, and it wouldn't have changed my decision.
But given that it was, as you just said, a big decision with important ramifications, and not one you could just make just like that,
no,
wouldn't it have been helpful to you to know what he hadn't seen, but you could now see, and why he hadn't seen it?
No, I don't think it would, because, as I've said again, I think it's very hard standing here today to explain to you the visual impact of that incident. So I think there are some things, absolutely, and it's an entirely reasonable question, because at some incidents you would want to have that discursive kind of brief where you understood how we got to that point, and why perhaps the decision you were considering was perhaps not appropriate, or was perhaps more nuanced than it might be in these circumstances. But I can only tell you that what I had seen in terms of fire spread in all directions, the full failure of compartmentation, left me in no doubt that we could no longer reasonably offer that advice. How we had got to that point, wanting to sound brutal, was almost irrelevant to me. I knew what I had. I knew what I had to do. I didn't have the time in that moment, faced actually with the potential for some civil disorder, with what I could see was a massive breathing apparatus operation already underway, to try and dissect what had happened in the previous hour, if I felt I didn't need to. And that may well sound cold-hearted, but I think that's part of the decision-making process. You take the information you need. At that point in time, I was satisfied that I had enough information to take that decision, And having taken it, I didn't then need to kind of go over it. I needed to get on with other things and start to place a structure onto the incident.
Yeah, I understand that in terms of leadership style, but really what I'm after is this process of making this decision. And it comes to this. Why were you not curious to understand why what was obvious to you was not obvious to Andy O'Loughlin, who was the incident commander you were taking over from?
Because I knew what I had, and at the risk of sort of repeating myself, I think that it wouldn't have been helpful at that point to dissect that. It was more about me having taken a clear decision because I was faced with the reality of what I was faced with. And that actually, because I hadn't seen conditions prior to me taking over, there could have been a wide range of variables that meant Andy's experience of that incident was very different. So, for example, Mike Dowden's experience would have been very different from mine because he was there right at the start when it was just a frigolite. So Mike's journey through that incident would have been hugely different from mine because he was decision-making in the context of an incident that was getting away, that was actually started as one thing but then had become something unbelievable. Andy actually, if I was to imagine what it might have been like the hour before me, and I don't know what it was like, was probably in a not dissimilar place where he was looking at an incident where he thought maybe he had more of an opportunity to do something, where perhaps there was more protection inside the building than at the point where I took over. And that was possibly why he didn't do that. But in a way, I didn't need to know that because what I did know was that at the point I took over, that advice was no longer appropriate for the people inside the building, despite the challenge of then giving them alternate advice because of the internal conditions that made almost any part of the building perilous. So I just didn't need to dissect it. And actually, I have to say, I don't think I consciously even thought that I needed to dissect it. I didn't think, I could ask him that, but I'm not going to. I just think I was so clear in my own mind about that one particular decision, having thought about it, having gathered information from a variety of sources, that having made it, I just needed to state it, record it, ensure it was communicated to the incident ground, verify that control knew that I had understood why they wanted to, and that we were going to hold to that, and then move forward with taking control of the incident.
How did you know, though, whether Andy O'Loughlin had or didn't have good reasons for holding on to the stay put advice?
Because I think if he had, he would have challenged me at the point I made that decision. I couldn't have been any clearer in my communication. He was on the command unit. I stated it to the entire command unit. And he absolutely had an opportunity at that point to say, and we've got a relationship. I've known Andy a long time. He's a good officer. He would have said, Andy, actually, how have you come to that? We have enough of a relationship that he could have challenged me. And I think one of the other things to reiterate, to give you a context, is that I knew most of the officers who were working for me very, very well, the senior officers. And I have an open leadership style where I would welcome critical challenge, because I think that's part of being a good leader. Yes, it's my decision to hold, but I would give people the space to ask questions and challenge. And I would have expected Andy, and Andy knows me well enough, that he could have stepped forward and said, actually, with the greatest respect, Andy, you have taken that decision over the course of the last 10 minutes. I have other information. I think you might need to think about that. At no point did Andy challenge that decision. He was entirely comfortable with it. And then we moved on, onto what were my priorities and how he was going to help me as part of the overall structure.
Given his lack of challenge and his lack of presentation to you of any further information that he had which you didn't, did it occur to you that he must have been operating, or at least was operating, in an information gap? You had information that he didn't have.
Absolutely, but again, I think, as I said yesterday, I think that is the normality of a dynamic incident. So you're constantly operating in an information gap. And what I can only talk about is my own decision-making. And I was comfortable on the basis of the information I had that I was right to take that decision, and that decision was right at that point in time. So in a way, what had happened before, I could have dwelled on it, but I'm not sure that would have been effective leadership or decision-making at that point in time at the incident. I think what I needed to do at that incident, and it was very clear to me, was that I needed to establish some very basic structure and control to enable us to sustain what was going to be a massive breathing apparatus operation. My greatest concern at that point, actually, was firstly creating a more open space for our people to operate in, so getting effective cordons in with the help of the police, and ensuring that we could resource it, because my greatest fear, we have enough resources absolutely in the London Fire Brigade to sustain that incident, but getting them there, turning them over, ensuring there was a system to safely deploy people into the building so that we could have this mass BA operation, they were the things that were in my mind, because without that logistic support and resourcing, we were simply not going to be able to sustain the tempo of operations that I had seen as I walked past the tower. So they were the things that really grabbed me as a priority. In a way, the advice that was given to people was obviously very important in terms of, helping manage an impossible situation and providing some care and reassurance to people in a desperate situation on the end of the phone. But in many ways, in the context of that big operation, the advice was somewhat irrelevant, because everyone inside that tower was in absolute danger. And actually, my sense was that it was going to be a minimal number of people who were going to be able to get themselves out on their own, absolute minimal, and we were going to have to rescue everyone that was still in there. My thought was that it was a mass rescue operation, and no one was getting out there without a BA crew helping them. Even if they could walk down the stairs, we would need a crew with them. So that was what my focus was on.
Why wasn't the stay put advice changed earlier?
I can't tell you that, because I wasn't there at that point in the incident, and I think it would be genuinely unfair on Andy and other officers to kind of hypothesise on the basis of hindsight, because what I did see of that fire when I turned up was that it was changing at such a rate of knots that almost anything could have been occurring inside the building at an earlier point in the incident. So I actually think it's unfair. I think people have to hold their own decisions at that point based on the information they had. I think it would be easy for me to hypothesise and criticise based on a subjective opinion, but I really don't know what the conditions were inside that block 10 minutes earlier before I arrived, an hour earlier, and therefore I think it'd be wrong of me to try and decide what should have been the right advice at that point. All I know is that at the point I turned up, that advice was absolutely unsustainable.
Absolutely unsustainable. Tell me, what plan did you have for ensuring that the occupants who were still within the building knew that the advice had changed and that they now had to leave at all costs?
So there was no way of affecting mass communication from the scene, because the building had deteriorated to such an extent that actually, just the overall level of sound, the chaos of it, would have meant it'd be very difficult to communicate to residents en masse anyway. Without wanting to sound facetious, I'm not being, a loud hailer would have been of no use. There was no tannoy system. I can't think of a method at the point at which that building was where we could have communicated with all the residents from scene. My expectation was that it all hinged on the advice that control was going to give people, because inevitably people were going to ring our control for reassurance and an update on what we were doing, and that was where the communication was going to have to happen from. Right. The only way we were going to communicate with residents from the scene was when we got a BA crew to them. So it was very important that our BA crews knew that we were taking people out of there and that everyone, was going to have to be rescued.
Did you take steps to find out whether control were doing callbacks to residents who had already called?
No, because, apologies, at the end of the day we had very experienced commanders inside control. So if we talk about delegated command again, that is a normal part of process. I would have expected callbacks to callers who they've had to come off the line from. However, again, I think I've got to set it in the context of the volume. I was aware, because at some point I'd spoken to Adrian about it, that we had maybe 9 control operators in the control room that night. Now, if they're handling the volume of calls we were, my expectation was some of that would have gone out to other control rooms around the country, potentially the overspill, and that actually just to manage that volume and callback would have been very difficult for them. But that would have been an expectation for me based on our processes that some level of callback would be occurring.
Right. So does that mean that in a normal incident, a callback would occur as a matter of practice?
Absolutely, yes, and that's my experience of FSG. Where there's more manageable numbers, our call handlers will make every effort to maintain contact with those people and close the feedback loop.
Right.
Because again, I suppose I'd ask the inquiry perhaps to reflect on the position those control operators find themselves in. I think actually they are the most exposed people in many ways, because they are remote from the incident, so they have very little power, as it were, to immediately affect the rescue. They are handling the emotions and the challenge of having an immensely distressed and scared person on the end of the phone. My experience of our control operators is that they are always desperate to maintain contact and provide reassurance, because that's what their role is. So yes, I would imagine they'd have been very motivated, and I know, because I've spoken to them since and visited them at control, that for many of them, the burden of not being able to do that in a way they wanted to and would have normally expected to has weighed very, very heavily on them. It's been immensely distressing for them.
Jo Smith gave us some evidence, when she gave evidence, that as a matter of practice, I think she said custom and practice, control room officers don't tend to call back callers unless they're on a mobile and have been cut off, because they wouldn't want to take them through a fire back to a landline to answer it again if that might put them in danger. That was the effect of her evidence. I'm summarising it, I hope, accurately.
You are, and that's what I'm
that?
talking about. So we're talking about people who've made a call, have come off the line on a mobile and can be recontacted.
When you say come off the line, though, cut off, she was talking about.
Yes,
mid-flow.
so the line's been cut dead.
Right.
So that's my understanding of how the callback process works, and I would have expected them to be doing that where they could, but I think that would have been extraordinarily difficult in the circumstances.
Right. Well, where they weren't cut off, but where the call had ended, because the controller had ended it, or because the call had ended it. My question is more directed to calling people back who had called historically and whose numbers were on the system, to tell them that the advice had now changed.
No, I wouldn't have an expectation of them doing that. And again, particularly in the volume of calls that they had received, that's not my understanding of how the process works. But I should hasten to add, I'm not a control room specialist, and I'm not intimately involved with those processes. My focus would be on ensuring that we are providing the information back into them to engage with callers as per our procedures, and that enables them to do their role.
Did you have any thoughts as to how, where people had called and been told to stay put by controllers, and then the advice had changed, how you were going to communicate to those callers that the advice had changed, so that the advice they'd been given previously should not be acted on?
I have to say that I didn't drill down to that level of detail. I felt that was the responsibility of control, having taken part in that decision themselves, to manage that process from their end. What was of utmost importance to me was that we got crews to people as quickly as possible and in a volume to kind of honour the change in advice.
Now, did you know that the building had an intercom system? So you press a buzzer and can be let into a flat?
So you mean like a door entry system?
Yes.
I didn't, but I guess that's a normal thing for a block of that size.
Did you explore whether that could be used to communicate with residents, to communicate to them that the stay put advice had changed?
I have to say I didn't, and I didn't consider it. But then again, I think in the context of knowing that the fire lift wasn't operating, that we'd lost almost every other building system, including the fixed installations, so the smoke ventilation system. Perhaps if I had even thought of it, I wouldn't have assumed that it would particularly have been useful. And again, there is something about the fact that someone's got to answer that. And I'm presuming that you would have to contact individual flats. I'm not sure how manageable that would be, because my experience of intercom systems is that they don't generally have a function where you can press one button and contact every flat. But no, I have to say it wasn't a consideration at the time. That wasn't how we were going to make contact with and communicate with people from the incident ground.
Okay. Now, then moving back to your entry in the row log, you say in the last sentence under 247, fire sector is briefed to that effect. Now, fire sector was the bridgehead, was it?
It was everyone inside the tower, basically, so not just the bridgehead. So what I wanted was Pat and Richard to be briefed to that effect. I asked for that message to be sent from the command unit out to the fire sector, so Pat and Richard specifically, to let them know that stay put advice had ended, and that's what Jackie has recorded there. So I will have verbalised that. I would have said to the command unit, can we make sure, now that the advice has changed, that is passed out to the fire ground as an immediate priority and to the fire sector.
Right. Did you hear the briefing to that effect yourself?
No.
Right. Turning to how you would then act on this changed advice, how would, in practical terms, how would you go about evacuating everybody in the tower?
I think evacuation is the wrong term. At the point I took over the incident, there was going to be no evacuation. There was going to be multiple individual rescues. So an evacuation gives you the idea that we were going to somehow take large groups of people out in a managed way, you know, through some form of mass communication, which is what a normal staged, phased evacuation would be. There was no evacuation in the context of that building. It was going to be individual rescues from individual flats, bringing people out in challenging circumstances. My major priority was to ensure we had the volume of people inside to be able to do that as best we could. So I think evacuation in some ways is a bit of a misleading term. There is no way you could have effected a mass evacuation from that building. It was going to be about our crews leading people out through a really difficult situation.
Right. So building on that answer, what was your plan to effect mass rescue? In outline, what were the nuts and bolts of that plan?
Right, so very simply, and perhaps if I can wind it back a bit, I actually had a more immediate problem in terms of effective mass rescue, which was about getting firefighters into the building without them being very seriously injured or killed. So I had a very serious concern about the level of debris fall. I was seeing large pieces of concrete. I was seeing very large metal sheets. My fear was actually that probably the most dangerous element at that point was getting firefighters into the building. So I wanted that considered as a primary objective for Andy O'Loughlin to try and establish some form of safe access and egress for our crews and any casualties they brought out. So at a very basic level, I just needed to safely get people into the building. I think that gives you an idea again of the sort of dynamism of the incident, that as a commander at my level, I was actually having to think about how we even got people into the building, never mind a plan beyond that as to how we would manage their progress inside the building. So having set that as an immediate priority, and actually that's where the territorial support group, and I'd like to say for the record what immensely brave men and women they are, because some of those people did hundreds of runs back and forth under the debris fall, and that is not what they're trained for. So I would like placed on the record how immensely grateful we are as a service to the Metropolitan Police Service for doing that, because they absolutely went above and beyond. But having established access egress, my plan was that to build on what Andy had already established. I thought he had a good basic structure that was simple enough for everyone to understand, and it was about ensuring we had a volume of people inside BA main control, that behind that we had a logistics system where appliances were arriving onto the incident ground, where officers were being briefed at the point they arrived that they were likely to be used with breathing apparatus, that they would then move into BA main control. The BA main control would be in direct communication with the fire sector, and that the fire sector would be advising, with Andy's oversight, because he was overseeing BA main control, FSG and the fire sector, the numbers of people to safely go in so that we didn't compromise ourselves in terms of having too many people in there so that we couldn't operate effectively, and that I wanted that to be continuous. My challenge I set Andy was that I did not want to break in BA operations, that I wanted that to be continuous, because I knew that prioritisation would be difficult. I knew that we were likely to be compromised by the nature of the building, and therefore the only way we were really going to make progress was just to ensure a continuous volume of people in there.
Was it possible that the change in stay put meant that you now had people coming into the stairs and into the lobbies that you otherwise wouldn't have had before, and that would have affected the dynamics of people flow in the building?
Absolutely. So, and that's the balance of that decision. So I was acutely aware that we had a single staircase.
Yes.
You know, it's not designed for both our personnel and personnel trying to leave being on it. But I didn't have a choice. So again, that's why it was important the fire sector knew the advice had changed, because they then needed to be aware that they might need to manage that flow of people out against the stream of people we wanted to go in.
Right.
My general sense, though, was that very few people were going to be able to make their way out on their own. So actually, I thought it was more likely that it was about ensuring we had a constant flow of breathing apparatus crews up inside the building as far as they could to rescue people.
Did you talk to Pat Goulbourne and Richard Welch at the Bridgehead specifically about how the change in stay put advice might affect the way they were briefing and deploying crews into the tower and the pattern of that deployment?
No, because again, I think that's a level of detail that I wouldn't need to go into with two such experienced officers, particularly having delegated them the tactical command of that sector. I would expect them to know that as professional fire officers. They're inevitably going to have to manage that. It's a fairly sort of common sense kind of factor to manage within that environment. You've got a single access staircase. We are going to commit crews in. If we've changed the stay put advice, there is very obviously every possibility that people are going to be coming out, and therefore Pat and Richard were going to have to manage that.
But you've quite rightly perhaps described how unusual this event was, but you now say that this is a fairly common sense factor to manage within that environment. How sure were you that Pat and Richard had the right experience and training to manage a sudden influx, a potential sudden influx of people into the exit route, single exit route, which was smoke logged in a 24-storey building, which was a whole building fire?
Very sure, because I trust those officers, and I've been on many incidents with them, including high-rise. And actually, it's probably, again, worth setting a wider context. Post-Lacanau, we experienced, actually, for probably 2 years, and we've experienced it post-Grenfell, unsurprisingly, a period of time where people no longer felt secure in the context of stay put advice, so would self-evacuate in very large numbers whilst we were trying to get into high-rise buildings. I've attended a number of high-rises where you've only got a single flat fire of no real great significance, but the entire block on discovering that, post-Lacanau, have emptied out. So actually, for experienced commanders like Pat and Richard, who had served in the Eastern Command, which is our busiest command, I knew they'd encountered that, and I would have expected them to understand how they might have to manage that problem. So I was confident. That's based on my relationship with them and my experience of being at other incidents with them.
But you say in that last answer that experienced commanders like Pat and Richard, having served in Eastern Command, had encountered that. I mean, are you sure they had actually encountered a fire like Grenfell before in their lives so that they could operate from the basis of experience?
No, none of us had encountered a fire like Grenfell. I think Grenfell is an exceptional event in any fire officer's career, so I'd absolutely not suggest that. But what they would have encountered is the difficulties of managing our entry into a block, even for a relatively minor fire where residents were trying to get out. That is a fairly common phenomenon post-Lacanau. It tailed off after a couple of years, but certainly post-Grenfell we've experienced it again with high-rise fires, completely understandably, because residents feel very anxious about the validity of the stay put advice, unfortunately.
I mean, to be frank, this was an experience new to you on the night. I think we've all got from yesterday's evidence that this was the first time you as an incident commander had to change the stay put advice so that everybody in a tower block had to be rescued, to cut a long story short. Given that was new to you as incident commander, how could you be sure, without going and talking to them about the granular nuts and bolts of their plan, that Pat and Richard knew what to do?
Because I did go and talk to them about the detail of their plan.
Right.
But that I think falls into the category of one of the general principles and understanding that I would expect a fire officer to have, that you will have to manage the flow in and the flow out of people. That's not necessarily something that I would need to discuss, because actually I think that's an assumption I could make. I think there are other elements of their plan I was much more interested in, i.e. the challenge of progressing within the building. What were fire conditions like that were preventing them, for example, progressing beyond a certain floor? I was much more interested in that in the context of my primary objectives. That caused me much more anxiety, that general progress in terms of clearing floors and moving up the building, because there were certainly times during the incident where I didn't have a comfortable feeling about how we were progressing. And that was where the focus of my discussions lay with Pat and Richard when I did see them. I wanted to know what was preventing them moving at a quicker pace up the building. I felt it was my job to drive that. I was less concerned about their management of people in and out, because I feel that's a level of detail that as group commanders, senior, experienced operational officers, I would expect them to manage as in the course of their duties.
Right. Now, you said in the beginning of the last answer, you did go and talk to them about the detail of their plan. First question, when did you go and do that? At what point?
I can't remember exact timings, but I went into the tower on a number of occasions.
Yes.
I would have to probably refer back to the logs. I went early on into the tower. I saw Pat and Richard, well, maybe just Pat at that point, and I had a conversation about how far they thought they could push up inside the building. My conversation each time actually focused on pretty much the same elements, because once I'd made the stay put decision, that was kind of done and part for me. We weren't going to reverse that. The conditions in the tower weren't going to get any better. So in a way that went. What then became a continuous re-evaluation of important decision making was actually how long could I safely keep on putting firefighters into the building, and how we were progressing. They were my two questions really continuously throughout the 10 hours I was in command, because they were the two things that were going to affect both the safety of my firefighters and the efficacy of our operations. How far were we progressing, and was it still safe, reasonably, to put firefighters into there, taking into account, our own powers and duties.
Right. And my second question is, what did you discover about the nuts and bolts of the plan at the bridgehead?
What I discovered was that Pat and Richard were sharing responsibility for it, which I was comfortable with. They know each other. They have a good relationship, as far as I'm aware. It was too big for one person to handle. That it appeared to me, from the short conversation I had, that Richard was, on the whole, handling the bridgehead, and that Pat was ensuring that there was a throughput of crews up and through, although I'm quite sure that swapped over at times over the course of the incident. What was clear to me was that there was some system for ensuring FSG information got to the crews were continuously being committed through the bridgehead, and that most importantly, Pat and Richard were very, very focused on maintaining progress. So as the overall incident commander, looking at it in the big picture, I needed to be assured that Pat and Richard had no illusions that what was important to me was that we were continuously driving momentum and progress, and we could not let that stall. And that even if so it's a constant judgment for them about how much risk they were prepared to expose our firefighters to. And that was actually very difficult decision making for a host of reasons. So that was what the majority of my conversations focused on.
Right.
How far they could get, what would be preventing them, why couldn't we overcome that?
As part of the nuts and bolts of their plan, did you investigate with them what they were doing with particular FSG information?
Absolutely not. And I think it would have been inappropriate at my level of command, overseeing the entire operation, to try and drill down into that level of detail. If I'd got drawn into the detail of what crews were going to what flat, don't get me wrong, it'd be absolutely different. If it'd maybe been 10 FSG calls, I would have had the time, the space, and I would have wanted to know how we were prioritising. In the context of over 100 FSG calls, I think actually I could have lost myself in that detail. What I needed to ensure, because it wasn't a given, was that we were continuing to maintain progress, that we had enough resources, that we were managing the wider environment, that I was mindful of the welfare of our people, that actually, just at a macro level, I was still right in my decision to continue to commit crews into the building, because that should not be taken as an assumption. That caused me great concern. Whilst I was very sure that the core of the building was whole, actually from what I'd seen in terms of the debris fall, what I was hearing from the building, the amount of time a fire of that ferocity had been burning, I was very much less sure about the edges of the building, the edges of the floor plate, the columns at the edge of the building, which were taking the brunt of the heat. I was fairly sure that significant spalling was occurring, so breakdown of the concrete, which would expose the rebar, and that I had the potential of losing edges of the building, partial collapses, and I had to constantly juggle whether or not it was still okay for me to commit firefighters into that environment, knowing that they're a very great risk. So everyone in our job accepts that there are times when you're going to have to risk your own life in a measured way to save others. But this incident took us to a place actually somewhere beyond that. And that was something I had to come back to continuously to judge actually whether I was doing the right thing by my own people under what is laid down in the Human Rights Act, for example. and whether what I was doing was justified by the powers we have under the Fire and Rescue Service.
Right. Now, you say in the middle of that last answer that if it had been 10 FSG calls, you'd have had the time, the space, and wanted to know how we were prioritising. My third question is, did you ask the simple question, how are you prioritising?
I'd asked it of Tom Goodall in terms of had he got a system, but I didn't delve into it in the detail. I know from Tom's board that he had prioritised, but I think, as I said yesterday, that wasn't my priority, because my sense was that prioritisation was only good in the moment because conditions were changing continuously. Right. That it would have been almost impossible to judge who was of greater priority than another, and therefore my focus had to be on just making sure that I was supporting my sector commanders by ensuring they never ran out of resources and that they understood we must maintain continual progress.
Did you endeavour to make sure that other emergency services like the MPS, the LAS and the NPAS were aware of the change in the advice?
I think at some point I had mentioned it in a tactical command meeting. So I think either the first one or a subsequent one, I informed all the other agencies that we had ended stay put advice. I can't remember my exact words, right. But I think I did that.
Now, Mr. Chairman, we're going to turn to a different topic. It's 10:30.
Yeah, well, it might be a good
time for a short break.
I think we're going to have a short break now, Mr. Rowe.
Thank you.
An hour is usually enough for most people giving evidence, I think.
Thank you.
So you go to the usher if you would. Please don't talk to anyone about your evidence while you're out of the room. And we'll be back at 20 to 11, please.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks very much. Right, 20 to 11, please. Right, Mr. Rowe?
Thank you,
Now,
sir.
before we continue, can I just mention one thing? You probably know that your every word is being taken down by the stenographer, but I think it would make her task a little easier if you could try and speak a little more slowly.
Absolutely.
And maybe keep your answers a little shorter, then she catches up to some extent between you and Mr. Millett. All right?
No problem, sir.
Thank you very much. Yes, Mr. Millett.
Can I just go back a little bit? I said I was coming to a new topic, and I will, but I just want to backtrack a little bit on one or two things. Just in terms of the stay put advice being changed, can you, from an institutional perspective, tell us what information you as an incident commander would need to have in front of you in order to make the decision whether to keep the stay put advice, as we've called it, in place, or to depart from it and give the advice you gave?
Do you mean that in terms of, sorry to clarify, is the information we would provide to our officers to aid them with that decision?
No. Let me put the question again, and I hope more clearly to you. As an incident commander, what information would you need to have in front of you in order reliably to make the decision to depart from stay put?
So I'd want to have, as I did on the night, an understanding of what callers might be facing in their flats, so a sense of what was happening at the control end. I think that would be very important. I would like to know the extent of fire spread as far as I could through the building. I would need to see clear proof that compartmentation had failed on a scale that meant that stay put was no longer viable, and I would need to understand the level of compartmentation failure in a whole building context. So, you know, were there parts of the building where it was still viable to maintain that advice? And actually, if we had a smaller number of callers, would you not change the device in totality for a block, but, you know, partially for a block, for example?
Right.
So they're the sorts of sources of information I would go to and the information I would want.
Right. Now, those factors which you set out very clearly, to the best of your knowledge and experience, were they to be found in any policy or any training as it existed in June 2017?
I think the only training that I had that was relevant to it was the post-Lacanau training package, which I can't remember whether it specifically refers to ending stay put. I'm not sure it does, but certainly made it clear to officers that you had to consider the possibility of buildings not reacting in a high-rise residential environment in the way you would expect. That's the only training package I think we've provided that would bear relevance to that.
Right. Now, coming back to this question of the nuts and bolts of the Bridgehead plan we were discussing together before the break, I just want to explore the timing of that. First of all, can you tell us, did you leave to go to the tower before or after your first TCM?
I'm not sure, is the honest answer, because I was in charge for a very long time. Where I've got things time stamped rather by other people, I've got a greater surety about my timings. There's clearly things that I am sure about because I remember the conversations. All I can tell you is that I was in the tower very early on during my time at the incident. I can't remember whether it was before the TCM or after the TCM. Obviously, I'd gathered situational awareness into the unit by going past the tower, but at a time either shortly after the TCM or potentially before the TCM, I'd been in the tower because I'd spoken to crews. I remember early on in the incident speaking to crews en masse, both outside and at the base of the tower, and inside the tower.
Okay, let's see if we can just drill a bit further down into this. Can I ask you to be shown your contemporaneous note? We could see from page 3, at 247, this is the second entry down, you refer to the stay put advice being changed, and then at 254 is the briefings, and that goes on. And then over the page, you see at 309 you ask the CU to order Lee drawbridge onto the incident. At 3:10, the CU confirmed you had a possible firefighter emergency. I stuck my head outside the unit, you say, and saw the same police officer. 3:15, you asked the CU to request the urgent attendance of a dangerous structures engineer. And then at 3:20, the first TCM, and then there's the detail of that. And then at 3:39, Matt Cook and Andy O'Loughlin getting onto the unit. And you get your first update. And then it's not until we get to over the page, sometime after 3:39, page 5, middle of the page, you say, I then went to the base of the tower to go into the lobby. Now, on the basis of our read of the contemporaneous notes that you did after the incident, it looks as if you didn't go to the base of the tower to go into the lobby until at or after, and probably after 3:39. Is that right?
I think what the statement reflects is what I can remember with accuracy. To be fair, I may well have gone into the tower before, but I couldn't tell you when. I went into the tower a number of times. The reason I remember that particularly was because of the incident involving, a poor gentleman who jumped from the tower. That is stuck very, very clearly in my mind because unfortunately he just missed me and hit the firefighter in front of me. So that is pretty much imprinted on my mind actually as a visit to the tower. So I'm able to remember that very clearly. I can't say with any confidence whether I went before that or if I went after that again until another occasion when I went in where I am clear about it, because I remember going in with the Commissioner and I remember thinking at the time the Commissioner was putting herself in very considerable danger, and this was an extremely unusual situation to be in when one's own Commissioner is running the possibility of being badly injured or killed at an incident.
Okay, let's see if we can get to the detail by some pictures. Can I ask first of all for Paul to put up a photograph on the CCTV that we have? Now, it's not the clearest, but this is at an adjusted time of about 3:02. I'm afraid I'm unable at the moment to give you the precise adjusted time to the second. Do you see yourself in that picture?
I think I do. I think I'm, there's no point pointing it on this, is it? I think I'm standing behind the gentleman wearing a command staff tabard, and Matt Cook is standing to my right. Danny Cotton is standing between Matt Cook and someone else, who I don't know who that is, standing in the corner.
Right. I'm sorry, I'm not entirely sure where you're pointing.
So, yes, there, where the arrow is. I think that's me.
You think that's you? Why do you think that's you?
Because of my helmet markings, because I recognise my hand movements, actually. I move my hands a lot when I talk.
Right.
So that is me, and I was talking to all the BA. I would imagine that's one of the points I was talking to all the BA crews in there.
Right.
About the extremity of the situation they were in, and that whilst we were continuing to commit them into the building, I expected them to take particular care with each other because we were trusting their professional judgment to progress as far as they could without putting themselves in, the danger of losing their lives.
Right. Just tell us about the helmet markings. What are the distinguishing marks on the helmet that identifies that as you?
That's the markings for an assistant commissioner, so the single thick band.
Right.
And I'm wearing the incident commander tabard as well.
Oh, I see.
So that is certainly me.
Right, okay. Now, on that visit, well, how long was that visit? Because, as I say, it's not in your contemporaneous note or indeed in your log.
I've got to say, it's come as a surprise to me that I was in the tower at that time. This is the first time I've seen this and understood myself to be in the tower at that time. But I think it reflects what I said earlier, which is, I think I've got a good memory of a number of things throughout the incident.
Right.
Obviously, where Jackie was making a log of my decisions, I'm clear about the time. I've referred back to vision for times when orders went from me, although I would accept that although the vision log says a certain time, I'm likely to have given the order either earlier, potentially, and it's been some delay to going. Actually, if I'm honest, I'm surprised I was in the tower at that point.
Right.
I don't remember going before the TCM particularly.
Right. Doing the best you can, Mr. Rowan. I know it's difficult. Did you have a discussion with Richard Welch and Pat Goulbourne at the Bridgehead at this time?
I would have seen one of them at this point, because there was, the one thing I do know is I know I went into the tower on a number of occasions. There wasn't an occasion, I don't think, where I didn't speak to either Richard or Pat, because the sole purpose of me going into that tower would have been to consider what the tempo of operations was. Did we have a system whereby we were maintaining continuous committal of crews up inside the tower? You know, what was actually the general composure of my firefighters?
Yeah.
What was the internal condition of the building, actually, even from lobby level, to be able to make some sort of assessment of that?
Did you go upstairs at this point?
No, and actually I didn't go upstairs at any point more than a few steps. I didn't go to the bridgehead at any point. So that wasn't my purpose for going in there. I needed to speak to my sector commanders primarily. It's an information gathering exercise to see them face to face, because our own communications on the fire ground were challenging because of the level of radio traffic.
Right. Now, at about this time, at this time adjusted, it appears that the bridgehead was still on the 3rd floor. From what you could see, was the bridgehead down on the ground floor by that stage, as best you recall?
I don't recall the bridgehead being on the ground floor at that stage. No, I think it was still upstairs.
So in order
at
to
that
go,
point,
so in order
if
to
I
go,
can remember it correctly, I mean, I have to say my memory of this happening at this time, this has genuinely come as a surprise to me that I'm inside the tower at this point at that time, but probably reflects the length of time I was in command and the dynamic nature of the incident.
Now, does that mean that you didn't have a nuts and bolts discussion, or any discussion at all, with Richard Welch and Pat Goulbourne?
No, I think I did, because whilst I might have got the time out of sequence, what I do know is every time I went into
it's my fault. I should finish the question. Does that mean that you didn't have a nuts and bolts discussion, or any discussion at all, with Richard Welch and Pat Goulbourne at this time?
No, because as far as I can recollect, every time I went into the tower, a priority for me was to speak to either Richard or Pat, because really they would have been, whilst I would have gained some situational awareness from observing, the real purpose of going into there was to get first-hand update from Pat or Richard, because they were my fire sector commanders.
Right.
And from what I recollect, there wasn't an occasion when I went into the tower where I didn't speak to them, at least briefly, to ascertain progress and have an understanding of their broad outline plan.
Right. So I'm just trying to get a handle on when you did first have this briefing with Pat Goulbourne and Richard Welch. If we go on to page 5 of your contemporaneous note, which is in the long block of text or narrative which follows the time mark of A339 on page 4, Mr. Rowe, it's the foot of the page. I received a quick brief from Pat Goulbourne and Richard Welch. Can you see that?
Yeah,
it's probably easy to look on the screen, actually.
Apologies.
Yeah. And this is in the block of narrative which starts the page before with the time mark of A339. Yeah. I received a quick brief from Pat Goulbourne and Richard Welch, who were running the fire sector. Between them, they told me they'd cleared as best as possible up to the 8th at that point, etc. I don't need the detail at this point. I'll come to it later. But just in terms of timing, are we to take it that the first time you had a brief from Pat Goulbourne and Richard Welch to discover what they were doing in the fire sector was after 3:39?
No, I don't think so. Now you've shown me that, because if I'd been in the tower at 3:02, I would have had a brief from Pat and Richard. It may well be that I've conflated more than one visit because of the span of time I was at the incident. So I remember going into the tower a number of times. The ones I can absolutely pin down in terms of detail are the ones I've recorded, because I know I left the unit because it was stamped and recorded that I'd gone. But I would not have received a brief from Pat or Richard when I was in the tower. You know, to the best of my recollection, every time I was in the tower, I had a brief from Pat or Richard, because I simply would not have gone into the tower without wanting that. Now, whether I've got the time wrong within my statement, yes, quite possibly, or whether in fact I've combined two conversations. I think that's entirely possible in the context of my memory. But I actually, if I'd gone in to get a brief inside the tower, then I would have got it earlier.
Well, let's just try and take this in stages. At 3:02 or thereabouts, allowing for the adjustment of the time, you would have had to have gone up to the bridgehead, which was on the 3rd floor. So do you remember doing that?
No. And I don't think I did, so I can only tell you what I remember.
Right. So do you remember, and I know you don't remember very much of that early 3:02 visit to the tower, but do you remember whether then or later either of Pat Goulbourne or Richard Welch came down from the bridgehead to speak to you?
Yes, definitely. I spoke to Pat and Richard, or either Pat on his own or Richard on his own, at the foot of the stairs on more than one occasion to receive a brief.
Did you ever speak to them at the foot of the stairs when the bridgehead was not at the foot of the stairs?
So sorry, could you ask that question again?
Did you ever speak to either of Pat Goulbourne or Richard Welch at the foot of the stairs, as you've just said, when the bridgehead was not itself at the foot of the stairs?
I can't recollect that level of detail. All I know is that I would have expected to speak to Pat or Richard when I went in.
Right.
To be fair, I can't remember going in at 3:01, but that would have been my expectation, and that's what my memory is. But as I said, it's a surprise to me. I was in the tower at 3:01, 3:02.
How long, doing the best you can with your recollection, how long after the change in the stay put advice at 2:47 did you speak, do you think, to Richard Welch and Pat Goulbourne about their plan?
Well, before I'd seen that CCTV footage, I would have said it would have been the visit that's recorded on the statement at 3:39. I would have thought it was them.
Yes.
Because prior to that, I was relying very heavily on Matt Cook and Mick Mulholland to keep me updated in the context of situational awareness while I was putting in the structures to support and drive the incident forward. And in fact, they were invaluable to me because of the difficulties with communications. They effectively became, for long periods of time, my conduit of information back and forth being carried out face to face. So going to Andy O'Loughlin, going into the fire sector, triangulating the information from fire sector to Andy and back to me and giving me a situational brief. You know, that's a very important part of their role.
Well, I showed you the photograph at 3:02, in fairness to you, because it's evidence, as you've confirmed, that you were in the tower at that stage. But if you ignore that for the moment, would what, on the basis of your recollection that you had prior to seeing that picture, mean that you didn't in fact do a face-to-face brief with Richard Welch or Pat Goulbourne about what they were doing until almost an hour after the stay put advice was changed, after 3:39?
I think, on the basis of my recollection, I would like to think if I was in the tower, I did, but that has come as a surprise to me, seeing that. And actually, you know, if I'm going by the statement, it would have been as its timestamp, which is 3:39, and yes, that would be the case. So I would have got a face-to-face brief from Richard and Pat at that point. Yes. Yeah. So I'm certain I did have a face-to-face brief with either Pat or Richard at that point. The fact that I was in there earlier, you've generally caught me by surprise, and I'm having to think about the events of the evening. Is actually, did I have a face-to-face brief at 3 in the morning from one of them?
Okay, and you can't remember, and that's fair enough. But on the footing of your statement and the contemporaneous notes, can you help me with this? Why would you have left it from 2:47 till after 3:39 to have a face-to-face discussion with Pat Goulbourne and Richard Welch?
Because I had officers to provide me with an update of situational awareness who were speaking to those officers face-to-face on a regular basis. I was at the very beginning of taking over a major incident that was likely to have an effect across the whole of the London environment, never mind the local environment it was in, that I needed to be sure that the structures that were going to support any activity on the incident ground, regardless of the tactical plan, were being gathered and managed appropriately, and I needed to brief officers who were going to take those roles forward into a delegated command. So I think it's more about, I could have taken the time, and clearly I did go into the tower at 3 to gather some situational awareness, but actually my recollection was focusing on putting in place the structures to drive the incident forward. I think, again, while situational awareness is absolutely vital for an incident commander in my position, what I am relying on inevitably, because of the size of the incident, the spans of control I had, was trust in the officers who had delegated command to make sensible decisions within their sector based on their own situational awareness, and receive continual update on that basis through whatever means I could. And I had that from a number of means. So I had Dave O'Neill was very, very important to me in terms of information update. So the sector safety commander, he was giving me regular updates about the challenges of getting into the building, the scale of debris fall, the potential of collapse, and Dave is an urban search and rescue specialist, so his advice was particularly valuable. I had Matt Cook and Mick Mulholland were pretty much on just a cycle of going out to the incident ground, confirming situational awareness as I'd asked them to, then coming back to me and confirming my understanding of what was going on and whether we were maintaining progress against my objectives. And I had Andy O'Loughlin checking in face-to-face with me. I think because of the challenges of communication, all of those conversations tended to be face-to-face, either coming onto the unit or me occasionally getting off the unit to have the conversations.
Helicopters, different topic.
Helicopters.
Were you aware that there was an NPAS helicopter at the incident, or above the incident, at about 2:47, when you took over, at the time you took over command?
I may have been. I can't remember it as a point of detail, but I would have expected them to be there because it was inevitable the Met helicopter would have been up.
Right. Can I ask you to look, please, at MET 0001861? And could you please turn to, well, I should just tell you what this is. This is an NPAS report dated 3rd of October 2017 by Inspector Simon Hepworth. And I can take you, please, to page 2, last bullet point. And this is 3 lines down from the start of that bullet point, where we see this. The tactical options available at incidents such as Grenfell Tower include video and/or thermal imaging downlink to the incident commander, recording of video evidence, monitoring by the crew, and verbal information passed to the incident commander, and stills photography. Other options might also be available, for example, use of high-intensity light or a loudhailer. Did you discuss those tactical options listed there with anybody?
Not as I remember, but actually we have an issue, or we had an issue at that time, from what I remember generally, with the availability of the downlink working on the command unit. So actually, whilst the information a helicopter gives you in many instances is very useful. So say if I had a large industrial building where I didn't have a full view of the roof and I wanted to understand the fire spread, very useful information, and I would request it. To be fair, I don't think in the context of Grenfell it would be my immediate priority, because it wasn't going to give me anything I didn't already know. I already knew the extent of fire spread. I could see it very clearly. We were close to the tower. It was obvious what it was. A vertical view of that was not going to really tell me anything other than perhaps what buildings might be at risk close to it, but I'd already had that information from elsewhere. High intensity light or a loudhailer would have been not useful at all in that context for 2 reasons. Firstly, the volume of noise. The only thing I can describe it to is perhaps go back to my military experience, which is I had never heard a volume of noise, an incident in the fire service that I could compare it to. The only comparison I had was to very, very serious, large-scale civil disorder at Drumcree, actually, where the level of noise was absolutely deafening. So to have tried to have spoken with a loudhailer to anyone would have been impossible because of that volume of noise. Right. You couldn't hear anything. No. And if you were going to use a high-intensity light, that wouldn't have helped us. We didn't have an issue with lighting on the external of the building. And actually, I wouldn't have wanted a helicopter too close to the building full stop, because it would have been difficult to judge, I would guess, and I'm not a pilot, but it would have been difficult to judge a safe proximity because of the scale of the fire and the products of combustion coming from it. The effect of downdraft would possibly have had a really detrimental effect on the building as well. So to use those 2 final tactical options would have been, I think, inappropriate. I think later on we considered as a very limited possibility calling in Coast Guard search and rescue because of reports of people on the roof. But I have to say, I don't think I'd have ever used that. We considered it as an option, but in the context of the building, I don't think that would have been a safe option for rescue. We just had to consider it because it was a tool in our arsenal.
Well, I think you've answered not just my question, but several other questions that I was going to follow up with. But just somewhere in there, there was something about the downlink not working. Did you know whether it was not working or whether the message was actually scrambled?
To be fair to me, it would have been the same thing. So my understanding of that is that organisationally we discovered, I don't know whether it was pre-Grenfell or post-Grenfell, it was something about the encrypting of information from the helicopter meant we couldn't pick it up for a period of time on our unit. That's my understanding of it. On the night, I cannot genuinely recollect whether I had that conversation. I would expect I would have done, but it's not recorded in any of my decisions logs, so I can't rightfully claim to say I definitely did. But it's kind of a normal expectation as an incident commander at my level to say, have we got the helicopter up? Have we got a heli-tele downlink? Unfortunately, my experience over a period of time around that time was that the answer was normally no, we haven't, right, because we can't receive the information.
Can I ask you to go to the IMP report for this incident, which is at tab 30 of the documents bundle, and turn in that to page 2, please. This is LFB quadruple 03114. There it is. And at page 2, you can see. Well, first of all, I should just ask: are you familiar with this document? I've jumped in rather at page 2.
I haven't read it since the PRC, but yeah, I recognise the document.
Okay. I mean, do you want? I can show you page 1 if you want.
No, that's fine. Sir.
Well, let's look then together at the second entry down under development. And the observation there is there was no access to the helicopter downlink, heli-tele at Stratford Control fallback. Review the equipment at our control fallback locations. Now, as a development item, am I right in thinking that this indicates that the absence of a helicopter downlink at Stratford was a problem?
I can't speak for the people who are at Stratford, but clearly it's there because I can only assume that they must have felt it was something that would have been useful for them to have been recorded as a development comment that has been picked up through the PRC process.
Right.
But I think that would have arisen from then. Okay. From my point of view, it would certainly be something I would have wanted to be working on the unit. So you could apply that logic as equally to the command unit as you could to Stratford Control. Right. I think ideally we would want that. It's a very useful piece of information.
Right. And therefore, were you hampered in any way by not having the heli-tele downlink working and giving you images?
On the scale of that incident, no. I don't think in the context of this incident it would have made much difference, but it is always useful to have a vertical view, but I wouldn't say it hampered my decision making, no. Or particularly changed my situational awareness.
Might you have been able, through the heli-tele downlink, to identify still living occupants at windows?
No, I don't think that from the view they had, my experience of heli-tele, I think that would have been difficult. I couldn't rule that out. To be fair, I'm not an expert, and I don't fly the helicopter and I don't operate the imaging equipment. But I doubt it would have had much use to us. And then we would have had the issue of tying that information up with what we were giving to crews internally and what we were committing them to. So, no, I don't think that would have been a major factor in terms of our overall decision-making or our intent in terms of the rescue operation.
Right. Now, can I ask you please to go to your contemporaneous notes at page 3, where in the middle of the page you describe your briefings, and I asked Andy to become my operations commander with responsibility for the fire sector, FSG operation and BA main control, and Steve West as command support, responsible for keeping the fire sector resources. I've shown you that as a platform for your witness statement, where on page 5, if you just go to that, you add to that. And it's your first statement, page 5. At the top of the page, you say, I explained to Andy I had 2 priorities for him. The first and most important was to work with Dave O'Neill to establish safe access and egress due to significant amounts of debris coming off the building. And we've discussed that already this morning. The second was to drive the rescue effort as hard as possible, focusing on savable life. Did you give Andy O'Loughlin any clue as to how, in practical terms, to go about that?
I can't remember the detail of the briefing to that level. What I do know is I set those priorities out. We talked about the need for continual assessment of how safe it was to commit our crews into the building, which ties in part with the instruction to work with Dave O'Neill and be mindful of the possibility of building collapse. I would have expected Andy, because of the discussion we'd had, to just focus on volume of BA crews in. I do remember saying something along the lines of we just need to maintain a continuous breathing apparatus operation at great volume into the building.
Right. When you received your briefing, and I know this is you giving Andy O'Loughlin your briefing as Ops Commander, but when you received your briefing from him, did he give you any clue about the strategy being carried out in the fire sector?
Yes, because he'd confirmed that he'd put in place an operation to commit as many breathing apparatus crews as possible into the building, and I concurred with his view on that it was going to be very difficult to prioritise in detail, and therefore we had to focus on just continuous volume of crews in to make sure we swept everyone up in the rescue operation. And the only way we could do that was to ensure we had that volume in there, and that was very challenging. So I think I need to set that in a context. So to maintain the volume, and actually I'm really proud of the officers like Dan Kipling, who ran BA Main Control, and Dave O'Neill, who was securing and managing the access egress. Those were extremely complex tasks. It's not as simple as people just walking into a building. This was the management, the recovery, the refreshing of sets, BA sets, to maintain a continuous stream of people into a building which was very difficult to access, maintaining egress for the other crews coming out. To not have a break in that operation, as far as I'm aware, I think was entirely impressive on those officers' part. I think that was very, very, very difficult. And actually, whilst I think you can focus on the question of prioritisation, my sense was the best way we were going to give people the best chance of being rescued was simply to flood the building with firefighters. Right. And to do that, it was a massive effort to do that as safely as we possibly could, maintain the throughput of resources so there wasn't a break. To my knowledge, there was never a break in committal unless there was a reason to fight the fire to enable committal to continue.
Mr. Ray, I'm sorry, I apologise for what I'm about to say, and I don't mean any disrespect. That's not just a very long answer to a simple, short question. But what I'm trying to do is to elicit the facts on the night by asking you a set of questions to which would be short answers. What I'm not after is your opinion of how things went, unless I ask for that. So I wonder if it might shorten things and help you if we just focus on, if we can, the answer to my question, because it normally leads to another question that builds on that. Do you see?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Apologies.
So we should try that out and see how we go. So my next question, following on from the answer to my last question, which was yes, I think, was did he give you specific details of the way in which he was carrying out the strategy of search and rescue?
I think that was the answer I was trying to give you. So it was that process by which we were committing people into the building and then ensuring that they went up into the building in as great a volume as possible. In terms of detail, do you mean detail in terms of what floors they would search first or how they would progress inside the building? Is that perhaps what you mean?
You tell me. I mean, go with that. Yes. Did he give you the details?
I think we had a
those
conversation on general principles about we wanted to progress as far as firefighting conditions would allow, and that we should seek to push beyond that. I think he may have made reference to a specific floor, but I can't remember. But my general thrust was that he was an experienced officer. As long as progress was maintained as best as possible in the face of difficult firefighting conditions, right, the tactical plan in terms of taking people out of the building would, to a sense, be down to him and Richard and Pat.
Specifically, did Andy O'Loughlin tell you during the course of his briefing to you on handover that he had been trying to get information both from the fire sector and from the FSG sector for some time, but to no avail?
No, he didn't mention that in that handover.
Right. Would you have expected him to do that?
To tell me that he hadn't had any information from them. If it had been a relevant factor and I had been operating in an absence of information, yes. Right. I didn't feel I was operating in an absence of information in terms of determining the primary objectives and driving progress forward.
Now, on page 5 of your statement, just a little bit lower down, you say, and it's 4 lines up from that same paragraph we were on, the final part of my brief to Andy was CU would set up channel 2 as a command channel on the fireground radio, and that my immediate priority was to get the police to secure the cordon. On that question of the radio channel, why did you think you needed to set up a separate channel?
I wanted a separate command channel so we had the space to talk and discuss, share situational information, confirm and agree priorities. That was going to be very difficult on Channel 1 because of the volume of traffic on Channel 1, simply because of the numbers of firefighters we had on the incident ground, and therefore constantly interrupting and trying to take a priority. I think for everyone on the radio that night, everything they were saying was a priority, obviously, within their individual circumstances. So I wanted a space where the command team could talk to each other, discuss decisions, drive progress without constantly having to find space within the overall level of radio communication.
And were you concerned that a system such as Channel 2 had not already been established by the time you arrived?
No, I wasn't concerned, but I wanted it set up again. I wasn't reflecting on what had come previously. I didn't really have the time and space to do that. I just wanted it because I knew that would be a better way of communicating it. I wasn't seeking to judge anything at that point. I just needed to put in place a structure and drive progress.
Right. Did you set one up?
Tried to. So I gave an instruction to the CU to set Channel 2 up. I asked them to pass that information out to the incident ground that Channel 2 would be set up, and therefore the command team should turn to Channel 2, only to find not long after that they had been unable to set Channel 2 up, which, to be frank, was frustrating, and that we would have to revert to Channel 1. At a later stage, we had a limited airwave network between myself and Lee Drawbridge to talk about the logistics and resourcing, which became increasingly important. But after that point, we had to work on the basis of runners, face-to-face communication, and doing our best with Channel 1 or mobile phones.
Right. In the next paragraph, you say that at 2:57, after the reference to the PPV, third line down, Channel 2 would not work, so we reverted back to Channel 1. Does that mean that, in fact, by 2:57, only 10 minutes after you've taken command also, you discovered that Channel 2 didn't work?
That feels about right, yes.
Do you know why it didn't work?
To be honest with you, I didn't dissect it in entirety. I may have said, can we be sure about that? That's probably the extent of it. But the command unit crew were very definite in telling me that Channel 2 was not working. In fact, they were upset about it because I'm sure they understood how important that would have been to me and why it would have been an important factor in that incident.
Yeah. Can I ask you, please, to be shown page 25 of the short incident log? And you'll see on that page that at 3:44 and 20 seconds, there's a make-up request from Control, SUP, CU8, request urgent attendance of radio engineer to assist with Channel 2 for Fireground. Now, it appears that measage went at 3:44, as you can see. And we don't, I think, have a message, at least in the short incident log before that, relating to Channel 2. Can you explain why the message wasn't sent, or the service request wasn't made until then?
No, I can't, and I wouldn't seek to excuse it. That probably is something that could have gone earlier.
Right.
Actually, seeing that.
Right. Did you actually know that a radio engineer had been paged to attend the incident at 1:35:27?
I didn't know that.
Right.
But I do remember that request going.
You remember that request going?
I do.
How do you know? How did you?
Because I do remember, because looking at it, makes me remember a conversation about a radio engineer coming, because I was frustrated with the communications on the night because we were relying so much on mobile phone, face-to-face and runners.
Right. Do you remember when you first discovered that a radio engineer had been paged some time before your arrival, in fact, a good hour and a quarter before your arrival?
I don't think I did know that. I think you telling me now is the first time that I've heard a radio engineer was paged at 1:35.
Oh, I see. Sorry, because you say, I do remember that request going.
No, I remember this request going off the CU.
I see. But you don't remember that there was a request at 1:35?
No, I don't.
Right,
No.
I see. And do you know, from your recollection, when the radio engineer arrived to try to sort out Channel 2?
No, I don't recollect when they arrived. All I do know is that there was never a successful setting up of Channel 2, whether the radio engineer arrived or not.
And did that hamper your communications, as I see, on the night?
Yes. Communications were extremely difficult on the night. You know, people really had to work very hard to ensure we were maintaining each other's situational awareness.
Yes. And you mentioned this a minute ago, I think. It's right that an airwave command channel was then set up at some point.
Yes.
And that was using, I think, 2 channels, FLONOPS 1 and FLONOPS 3. Did you remember that?
I do. I don't remember the specifics of the channels used, but I remember using that airwave channel to talk to Lee and possibly to other officers as well.
Right. And do you recall when those airwave command channels were later set up? Roughly what time?
I think they were set up about the time that Lee Drawbridge had arrived at the incident. So
Yes.
I think it coincided with when Lee arrived, and then we set those up because I now had someone who was going to handle a very significant resourcing effort for me, and I really, really did need to be in communication with him. And I would add, of course, most of the time I'm not handling my own communication. I'm giving instruction, and I've got someone who's doing that for me on the command unit, so it wouldn't necessarily be me directly talking to those officers.
Yes.
But I would have been seeking information using that network via a proxy, via one of my officers who was doing it for me.
Right. Now, in fact, we can see from page 7 of your log that you briefed Lord Lee Drawbridge at 4:35 a.m. Sorry, let me just put a slightly different point to you. In fact, Lee Drawbridge says in his statement that a second airwave channel was set up, I think, just shortly after 4 a.m. That's what he says. It's a simpler way of going about the same point. Does that accord with your recollection?
Yeah, I think it does.
Right. Do you know why it wasn't set up sooner than that?
I don't think that we had the structures in place to make best use of it, actually. I think we were still in a stage there where we were ensuring people were briefed, that we had people actually in a physical position to start managing the resources. And also, the issue with setting up an airwave network is that not all officers will, as practice, carry their handheld airwave. You would need to confirm that people had it.
Yes. Can I ask you then to go to the PRC notes, just to pick up on that last point, and go to page 6. This is LFB quadruple 03112. And 2/3 of the way down that page, you see issues with comms. You see officers left airwaves in car. I felt really constrained by comms. Officers left airwaves in car. I want to focus on. Are officers meant to take their airwave radios with them onto the incident ground?
As written in our policy, no, which I think should be changed.
Right.
And I'd felt that, to be fair, prior to this incident, because we'd set up an airwave comms network on the Croydon tram crash, and it was immensely useful.
Right.
And I've done it on other incidents previously. So I felt that was something in a policy that was focused on security because of the need for digital communications to remain secure in a multi-agency emergency service environment. So they're left in the car for security. But actually, I think that bit of policy needed to change,
right,
because I would rather they had their handheld airways with them,
yes,
to exactly deal with the sort of situation I faced. But I had no confidence that they all would have them because of that policy.
Yeah. Well, the chairman is listening carefully to what you've just said about that. But just going back to the night, was the view that that policy should be changed a view that you held before the Grenfell Tower incident?
Yes.
Was it something you raised with the very few people who were senior to you?
Yes, and I think there had been a discussion about changing it. I can't remember the exact particulars, but I'm sure that it had probably arisen as a PRC point, perhaps in other incidents.
Really?
Yeah.
Do you know why? Well, was it being taken forward at that stage as a policy change?
I don't know, but the conversations I had, people would agree with it. I don't hold responsibility for that policy, but my sense was that, yes, people understood that. I mean, I think there is a debate about the security of those airwave, because whilst it's very important for us to communicate on the fire ground, obviously they're a very security sensitive piece of kit that would enable someone, if it went to the wrong place, to have access to secure digital communications, for example, the police responding to a terrorist incident. So there is always a balance between the security and the availability of that equipment. And I guess that's where that had come from. But on the balance, for me, my personal opinion is that we should end that piece of policy and officers should be carrying their airwave onto the incident ground.
Thank you. Now, to go back to page 5 of your witness statement, at the same paragraph we were looking at, the second paragraph, you say, at 2:57, I requested positive pressure ventilation / specialist entry recovery team, CERT, via the duty DAC. And then you go on to say, my reasoning was that we might be able to use to fan and high-pressure lance technology in some way. How did you think the PPV would be able to work in the circumstances you were seeing?
I couldn't say for definite that it would work, but it's about having the tools in your arsenal available. So even if you discount them, there's nothing to hurt getting them there, and things have always got to move a distance, so you might as well get them moving. So it wasn't that I was definite that PPV would be of use, but I could see that we might use it in some way to improve conditions potentially in the lobby, that we might be able to drive smoke out of the lobby area, so it was better for officers and crews in that part of the building. Did
you make an inquiry of anybody on the incident ground about whether there was a smoke ventilation or extraction system in the building?
I don't know whether I made the inquiry, but I certainly had a conversation at one point with, it might have been Matt or Mick. I had a conversation with someone about the fact that there was a smoke ventilation system that wasn't working. So I knew that there was a fixed installation, but that it wasn't working.
Right. Did you investigate why it wasn't working?
No, because I think looking at the building, I was convinced that along with the fire lift and other aspects of the building's system, it was the extent of damage and fire spread to the building that was preventing it working.
Right. Now, you also say that in the last sentence of this paragraph, I asked the unit to get a better map, but they confirmed the command support system wasn't working. Short sentence, 2 issues. First of all, when you say better map, what were you after? Was that a diagram of or a plan of the building?
I think a map in all contexts, so a better map of the wider area that we could see in larger scale. So I had an understanding of other things that were likely to be impacted. So, for example, you've got Latimer Road Tube very close to Grenfell. I was greatly concerned about the possible impact as we got closer to rush hour on the tube line, both in terms of risk to people on that tube line, the wider impact, on the transport network.
Right.
And I would have liked an understanding of that. I wanted better plans of the floor plates because I would have liked the BA crews to have that.
Yes.
So I think it was on every level. I wanted better information visually about the area and the specifics of the tower itself.
I see. We'll come to talk about plans specifically in a minute, but just focusing then on the command system not working. Was that the command support system, or CSS, on CU8, which you were on?
Apologies. So, yes, I was told that CSS wasn't working on CU8.
Were you surprised?
No.
Does that tell us that they don't often work, or they often don't
I think
work?
that they work inconsistently. So it didn't particularly surprise me because I've been at a number of incidents where CSS hadn't worked, and it wasn't for one organisation you're trying to fix it. There's been a huge amount of effort in trying to fix what is an ageing system, and we're now in the process of procuring an entirely new system to replace it. But no, I wasn't surprised.
When you say you're now in the process of procuring an entirely new system, were you in that process prior to the Grenfell Tower fire?
Yes, my understanding is that process had started before the Grenfell Tower fire. So again, it's not my area of responsibility, but there had been continued organisational frustration with CSS.
Right.
That was well known. It was well noted. It was a repeated point raised on PRCs, PROs, on the incident management database. Work was beginning, as far as I understand it, to procure a new system to replace CSS, which was an ageing system and at times inconsistently operating.
Did the absence of CSS hamper you personally in your role as IC on the night?
In some aspects, because you get access to better mapping. Actually, I think the organisational part of CSS would have been less useful because of the scale of the incident, actually. So you can create an organisational structure that would have been useful in some ways, but actually it was so large in terms of the resources coming on, I think the information would have been crowded. It was primarily the mapping, really.
Okay, I was going to ask you, in what aspects specifically were you hampered by the absence of working CSS?
I think it was more than anything the mapping. I would really have liked the mapping.
Okay. The non-functioning of CSS looks, from your statement, to be something you experienced at 2:57. Is that right?
If that's what it says in the statement, that would be to the best of my recollection.
Right.
Yes.
And the reason I ask you is, but if you go to your log at page 2, you can see that at 04:03, which is a good hour and a quarter or so later, it says, the 3 entries up from the bottom, the command support system has gone down. And I'm asking really whether that was the first time it had gone down but had been operating until then, or whether it had not been operating at all.
No, it had not been operating at all. So this is Jackie's log, isn't it? So whether I've asked her to do that or whether she's noted that, I couldn't tell you.
Right.
No, command support had not been working prior to then, and
Right.
I'm sure it wasn't.
Do you know why Jackie would have noted it at that time rather than at the start?
Genuinely, no.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, I'm going to turn to a different topic. I always say that. I hope to stick to it. It may be a convenient moment for another of our hourly breaks.
Yes, well, that would
Thank you,
seem
sir.
sensible. We'll have another short break now, and as before, please don't talk to anyone else about your evidence, and we'll resume at 11:45, please.
So.
Right, would you like to give the usher? Thank you. Right, 11:45, please. Right, Mr. Rowe, ready to
Thank you, sir.
continue? Thank you.
Sir.
Mr. Rowe, thank you for coming back to us. Can I take you now to 320 and your first TCM? In your witness statement at page 6, if you please go to that, you see that in the middle of the page you say, at 3:20 hours I chaired the first tactical coordination meeting. Details are recorded in the decision log that you exhibit. In summary, this included the use of TSG to deal with a deteriorating public order situation, safety of partners within the inner cordon, and no one should be moving independently of the fire service, etc. And then at the end of the paragraph you say, I requested plans from the local authority which I did not get. I just want to focus on this question of plans. At that stage, did you consider that not having plans of the building was affecting your ability to make command decisions?
I think at the level I was operating, no, because I was making big command decisions about the broad thrust of the incident. But for those officers I delegated command to form a tactical plan. So, for example, Pat and Richard particularly, were going to have to continuously judge to what level they could push people up inside the building, sometimes have to draw people back, what would be their priority as to what level they would go to, perhaps even missing floors. And to do that, it was always going to be better if they had detailed plans that showed the floor plates.
Right. Did you know they didn't have plans?
I didn't know that they didn't have, well, to be fair, I'd assumed they didn't have plans because we didn't have anything on the ORD, and I'd asked whether we had plans from local authority and we didn't, so I would have assumed they didn't have plans in that sense.
Right. Okay, let's explore that a little bit, just if we can. I understand your last answer about you not needing them, but they would. Did they tell you, we don't have any plans, can you get them for us?
I can't remember, but I would have wanted them as a matter of course, because I think that is a very important part of information for our crews to have. So I would have asked anyway.
Now, you said also that you didn't have anything on the ORD. Anticipate some questions I have later, but did you check the ORD when you got onto the command unit?
I think I answered that yesterday, actually, that I hadn't checked it in the detail, but I'd asked the command unit staff to tell me whether or not there was useful information on the ORD, whether it would be of use to me, and I was told actually no. Now,
you also, I think, cover this, but I just want to look at it a bit more closely. Would you expect, or on the night of the fire, let me put it this way, would you have expected that the plans would be available to the incident commander who was first at the scene?
Yes, I would have expected a plan of the floor plate on the ORD.
Right. And if not on the ORD, would you expect it in a premises information box or an electronic premises information box?
Dependent on the type of building, yes. It's not mandatory for a tower of Grenfell's type to have a premises information box. But I would have expected crews to have had access to a plan of some sort through those systems, yes.
Right. And you say plan of some sort. Can you just give us a rough feel of how detailed the plans that you would ordinarily expect to be available would be?
On an ORD entry for a block of this nature?
Yes.
So an outline plan of the floor plate in particular, so numbers of flats on each floor, and an outline drawing of the size and shape of the building,
right, with
marking as to where perhaps dry riser outlets might be, hydrants external to the building. So a plan that would allow people to put our high-rise procedure into effect. So where the hydrant is, where you're augmenting supply, the nature of the block in terms of how the flats are split within the block, and an understanding of the floor plate. Is there 4 flats on each floor? Is there 2? The nature of the lobby. So that sort of detail.
Right, okay. And if that sort of detail, as you've described it, wasn't available on the ORD, then where would you expect a watch manager or incident commander of any level to get them from?
Well, if they were lucky enough to have a premises information box there, you might go to that. At a larger incident, as I did, you would perhaps ask the local authority, would have access to housing records, to maps and plans of all the buildings within their area, their purview. So there's 2 possible sources. depending on the type of building, a responsible person who was responsible for the fire risk assessment of that building in a commercial building where one was required, and they might have maps. So lots of sources where you might get a map from, or in worst case, actually, I would expect a degree of common sense to be applied as an officer, because you want to know that floor plate and the layout of the flats. You would normally go to an unaffected floor if you didn't have a good plan and draw yourself a plan. So you'd go to an unaffected floor, have a look at the makeup of that floor, and then draw yourself a diagrammatic, representation of that floor, so you could plan off that and work off that.
Yes. In your last answer, you said, and I just want to follow this up, if they were lucky enough to have a premises information box, then you might go to that. When you say lucky enough, does that indicate that actually premises information boxes, to your experience, were rarities in London?
Not rarities, in that there's a lot of them, but obviously there's a huge amount of building stock in London, and you don't need a premises information box on every type of premise. It's on
I'm talking about high-rise in particular.
High-rise in particular. No, my experience is that you wouldn't normally have a premises information box, actually. So I think one of the reasons for ending up with the EPIP was that actually it was a challenge to have the metal floor diagram plates and a premises information box in every high-rise. That's part of the reason for the EPIP system,
right?
The electronic, I'm trying to think of the way to describe it, the electronic plan system, because actually there isn't a premises information box at every high-rise premise. No.
Right. Okay. Are you aware of the contents of the London Resilience Plan?
Not in detail as regarding premises information boxes. No.
Okay. All right. Well, you may have to revisit that either later or with somebody else. Would you have expected any previous incident commander attending this incident to have requested plans of some kind of this building before your arrival?
Before my arrival? I think that's an early expectation of incident commanders, yes. But again, in defence of my junior officers that night, they had an awful lot to deal with. And actually, they may not have had someone immediately available to request those plans from. So if they weren't on our system and there wasn't someone from the local authority they would have been able to get them from, or if they haven't identified a premises information box, then actually I think I can excuse them that. But yes, that is something that I would have expected in the gathering information part of the decision-making model. So that's one of the first things you would think about is, have I got plans? Where can I get plans from?
Right. Okay. Now, turning to you, what efforts did you make to request plans of the building?
Repeated requests through a number of tactical command meetings.
Right.
So directly to the local authority representative at those meetings. I think repeatedly outside of those meetings possibly as well. I think it was a question I kept on coming back to because I became... I couldn't understand why they weren't able to get them to me, actually. I think it took an unreasonably long amount of time to get those plans to us. We did get them in the end, but it was very much later in the incident. Yeah,
we'll come to that. But did you request plans at the very first TCM, do you think?
I can't recollect.
No,
I know I certainly did a number of TCMs. Whether I did on the first one, I can't recollect. I know from reading my own decision log that actually it's not recorded there that I did.
No, quite.
But I can't remember whether I did or didn't.
Okay. Is it something that you would have expected Jackie McConaughey to have logged, your request?
But to be fair to Jackie, not necessarily, because although Jackie is an experienced officer and had worked in fire investigation, we don't formally train large numbers of people to be incident logists. So she was doing her best as a logist.
Right.
So I think to assume anything about that would be wrong with me. I think she did an incredible job over a very long period of time, logging, many decisions.
Now, if you go to your witness statement, which I think we're probably still on actually at page 6, you do time the request for plans as at the first tactical coordination meeting at 3:20, but we don't see it in the log, or indeed in your contemporaneous note. My question is, where did you get that time from as the time at which you asked for plans?
So is this one of the police interviews?
Well, this is your first witness statement.
So I think this was the first interview I had with the police was very long, and I was recalling as best I could at that point within the interview, so I guess it probably came from there. And I would have, I think when asked, when I was talking about the detail of what I've covered in the TCM, that would have been one of the things I would have expected to ask.
Okay.
And that was what my memory, it's been recorded faithfully by the police officer who is recording that interview. So that's what I said, and that's what I believed at that time.
Right. If you turn to page 5 of your log, you can see that at page 5, halfway down the page, there's a discussion at 6:13 with the DSE district surveyor, and at the end of that it says, "Will attempt to locate plans." Do you think that was the first time in the night when you discussed plans?
No, definitely not. I discussed plans over a period of time much earlier than that.
So this is the first mention in your log of any discussion about plans?
No, I'm certain I'd asked about plans on more than one occasion prior to that.
Right.
I can't give you the exact timing, I'm sorry, but okay. I'm really certain about that.
Now, doing the best you can to recollect, do you remember who you asked the plans of?
Well, I think I asked the local authority representative on tactical command meetings for the plans. That's what I recollect. I can't recall necessarily the first meeting I did ask them, but my feeling is that I did it earlier. I certainly asked the CU crews to see if they could get me plans earlier on, and I had that. I know I asked that question on more than one occasion because they're the people who are likely to facilitate that contact with the other agencies who are there. And I'd asked on more than one occasion. It was definitely before 6:13 in the morning.
Right. Do you remember the name of the local authority liaison officer or other officer that you asked to get the plans?
No, but it would have been whoever had attended the meetings, because I think we'd had a change of Laylo at some point in the incident as well.
Yes, you did.
Yeah.
Does the name Nick Layton ring a bell?
Nick Layton does ring a bell, yes.
And then Mike Rumble. Mike Rumble.
Yeah, they both do. Both names, now you said them do, but
okay.
I wouldn't immediately remember them until you reminded me.
Nick Layton, we have a statement from, and he hasn't come to give evidence yet, so we'll need to explore this with him. But I want your recollection. He says that he was there between 2:30 and 7 a.m. He came onto the CU at 2:30 and left the incident at 7 a.m. But during that period, he wasn't asked for plans at all. Can you comment on that?
That's not my recollection of it. I recollect asking, and again, you're going to have to forgive me. Obviously, I was talking to many people over the course of a very long period of time, and my recollection is that I made requests through the CU, and certainly earlier than 6:13 had spoken to someone in the local authority about availability of plans. That is my recollection.
Right. And were you on the command unit at that time when you made that request or request?
Yes. So at any point I would have made that request, I'd have been on the command unit.
Right. If you go on in the log to page 7, a third of the way down, I suppose just above half the way down, just above the time mark of 07:35, and this is at the very end of, or appears at the very end of the note dealing with a TCM that starts the page before at 7:13. Do you see that?
Yes, I do.
It says, Andy Rowe requests plans from local authority. Lalo is Mr. Rumble. This is the 4th TCM. It looks from that as if you didn't ask the Lalo for any plans at any earlier stage, according to this log. Can you comment on that?
That may well be as recorded in the log, but I am certain that I asked for plans either via the CU or directly to someone in the local authority prior to that time. That is my recollection.
Right. And if you go to your second witness statement at page 7, just around this point, off a bit, you say there, about halfway down the page in the text, I asked for 5 hours for the building plans from the local authority. I would have wanted these a lot earlier to get a better understanding of the building. How do you measure that 5 hours?
I couldn't tell you now where I'd measured that from to, but I have a very clear recollection of being frustrated that I didn't have a detailed set of plans from the local authority and that I had to ask repeatedly. I thought over an extended period of time. So that is what my recollection is. I remember requesting via the CU and certainly to someone directly in the local authority on more than one occasion plans and over an extended period of time.
If you go to your contemporaneous notes and turn to page 8, we see under the time mark of 0451, this is the last entry before 0516, I asked the CU crew why we still didn't have plans of the building. They confirmed again there were none on the ORD, but they were meant to be in a set of premises information box. There were meant to be a set in a premises information box in the lobby of the tower according to the ORD entry. I asked for this information to be relayed to the fire sector and made a note to ask for a set from the LA at the meeting again. That last comment there rather suggests that you were asking the CU crew, but you hadn't yet asked the LA. Unless the word again rather indicates that you had already asked. Could you just explain? You say you made a note to ask for a set from the LA, the local authority, at the meeting again. Can you just help us with that?
Absolutely. I mean, I don't know whether I'd asked the local authority before this point for certain, but what I can confirm is I have a strong recollection of asking the CU to contact someone in the local authority to ask for the plans. I think I did ask before this time, but I can't give you an exact time. I just know it was something that actually became very important to me, and I remember thinking over the course of the incident, I don't understand why I haven't been furnished with this set of plans because they would be very useful to my crews. It became something that actually I felt had taken far too long to be given to us. So I can only apologise if I can't give you the exact sort of start and finish times of that process to try and get some. But I'm very clear that I had earlier conversations than 613 about wanting those plans and wanting the local authority to supply them.
Do you remember being told by the CU crew that there was an premises information box according to the ORD entry?
Well, as was written on that statement, I must have been, because that was when the memories were fresher in my mind, but I can't remember the exact conversation. If I've written it, I imagine at that point I must have remembered it, so yes.
Right. Did you know that, in fact, the ORD had an entry of false underneath the box in the premises information box part of the ORD?
No, I didn't.
Right. So can you explain at all why the CU crew... Well, let me ask you this way. Do you remember who told you that the ORD did say there was a premises information box?
No, I don't.
Okay.
I don't remember who specifically on the CU crew did, but I do remember there being a conversation about a PIB, and I do remember asking that information went to the fire sector.
Right.
The exact detail of that conversation, the length of it, I can't.
Right.
In sort of granular detail, but I do remember that conversation happening, yes.
When you were told, according to your note, by the CU crew that there was an premises information box according to the ORD entry, did you chase up somebody to go and open the premises information box and get the plans?
No, because where that was of use was for Pat and Richard, and that was one small piece of information within a mass of information, and I just want it confirmed that that message had gone to the incident ground, and therefore they would have the opportunity to pull plans out. In following up again, repeatedly on where detailed plans were, again, I would have expected a return of information about that if they had found a very detailed set of plans.
Do you know if anybody from the TMO or the council were asked about the premises information box?
About the premises information box?
Yes.
No, I don't.
Do you know why not?
No, I don't.
Do you remember what time you eventually did receive the plans?
I can't remember the exact time, but I know we did receive a set of plans.
Right.
And that was, I don't know whether it's recorded within a TCM, I can't remember the detail of my own log. But we certainly did receive plans of the floor plate. But
since you mentioned it, that it is recorded, it's 8:45, and if you go to page... well, let me just show you this. It's actually 7. Forgive me, I've got a wrong reference there. The thing I want to show you then is the plans themselves. If you go to LFB quadruple 1968, let's try it this way. LFB quadruple 1968. And go please to pages 49 and 51. Were those, or are those, the plans that you received at some point?
Yes, I think they are, because I saw them briefly.
Right.
I do have a memory of that, so that seems familiar to me, yes.
Yeah. Well, let's just see if we can pin this down as a time. Can I ask you to be shown MET 000018729? 18729. Now, that's a photograph taken on CU8. And if we blow it up, there it is. Do you think we can see those plans on that picture?
Yes, I can.
So they came in at some time. And if I can ask you to be shown INQ quintuple 0164. Okay, no, well, right, all right. I'm going to cancel that, much to your relief, and I suspect that of others. Let's move on. You had those plans at some point, but roughly, do you remember when you first saw them?
No, I can't give you an exact time. I know I did, though, because now I've seen them. That does remind me.
Okay. Did you send those plans, or make a copy of those plans and get a copy sent to the Bridgehead?
Yes, so I made a request for them to be copied, either the original to go, because I think what's pinned up is a photocopy actually from somewhere, and I don't know whether that came from outside of the unit, but I think we held a copy, and I think the originals went to the fire sector, so I did ask for those to go. Right.
On a related point, can I ask you to be shown, well, do you remember seeing a board on CU8 showing the flats and floors?
I can't recollect the detail of it, no.
Okay, let's see if I can help you. Could you please be shown MET 000015927? Now, this is another photograph taken on CU8. Now, you can see the time at 6:44 in the morning. And on the right-hand side of the picture, you can see a plate or board with floor level and flat numbers. Do you remember seeing that at any point on the night?
I actually don't, no.
Right. Okay. If it was on CU7, which it might have been, do you remember seeing it there at any point?
I don't.
Or knowing about it? Right. Do you know anything about the removal of this kind of thing, kind of plate from the building by a watch manager or any other officer?
No, I have no recollection of that. That wasn't a piece of information I was made aware of,
Okay.
that we'd removed the plate with the floor numbers on.
Right.
Not to the best of my recollection, anyway.
Okay. Now, we've had some evidence from watch manager Watson, who was a watch manager at the incident, assisting the coordination of FSG information to the bridgehead at an earlier stage in the incident, that he drew or asked a crew manager to draw a plan or on the wall of the second floor mezzanine, so that BA crews could be briefed about where to go. Do you remember seeing that on the wall at any stage during the night?
No, because I don't think I went up to the mezzanine.
Right. Can I just show you one or two informative messages from the scene? First of all, page 25 of the short incident log. Where at 3:48:17, halfway down the page, so this is pretty much exactly an hour after you took over, just over an hour after you took over incident command. There's an informative message, SUP CU8 from AC Row, so it comes from you. A residential block of 24 floors, fire from 2nd to 24th floor, approximately 100 individuals involved, FSG major incident declared, high-rise procedure implemented, etc. That says the building has 24 floors. Is that what you believed at the time?
Yes.
Right. Which did you think was the topmost floor?
In terms of the numbering. So
Yes.
it's a building of 24 floors, but in terms of numbering, it's numbered from ground to 23rd, I believe.
Okay.
But
So-
it is a building. It's correct to say that is a building of 24 floors. That is how we would describe it. That's our protocols for describing it in an informative message.
Yes, I follow.
But in terms of what I remember is it's ground to 23rd.
I see. So just in brief, you count the ground floor as floor 1.
Yes.
Right.
So yes. So
Okay.
it's 24 floors because that's the number of floors.
Yes, I see. Were you, just sticking with this short incident log, did you have access to this log in CU8?
No, because it wouldn't. No, I didn't.
Okay. Were you listening out to radio messages coming from control?
My control operators would be, again, I think I've got to go back to my role at the incident because it's necessary for me to have the space to hold the full span of control across all those different commanders, the bigger picture, talking to the monitoring officer, Danny, thinking about the big piece. What I can't do is monitor the radio. So I've got a radio operator to do that who will highlight relevant messages to me where they, and I'm relying again on the professional skills and judgment of those command unit operators. I would have known that message went because I would verify all messages that went because someone would have drafted it based on information gathered from a number of sources, whether it's the team leader of the CU going out and gathering their own situational awareness, talking to ORT coming back in,
Right.
or interrogating ORT or another command officer for that information.
Just focusing on some detail, in that message, we can use the one at 3:48:17, although there are similar messages like it elsewhere in the log. You can see approximately 100 individuals involved. Did you get that 100 figure from Tom Goodall?
Yes. So at that point, I still don't think we had a complete handle, from my perspective, on the numbers of FSG calls because they were coming in. So that is my memory of that.
Right.
So it's an approximation and the purpose of that message is to inform those people who are monitoring remotely and the wider organisation about the scale of the incident, rather than acting as a definitive record of exactly how many people were involved at that point. Obviously, if we can give that, that's very important. That would be your aspiration. But actually, what is more important is that we're telling the story of the incident so that people understand how it's progressing, the challenge we're facing, and therefore can use it to inform their own decision-making remote from the incident.
Yes. Did you get that information from Tom Goodall, do you think, face-to-face or by some kind of radio communication?
I couldn't tell you. In the context of how that message was composed, I couldn't tell you.
Right.
But I would think that would be where it would come from.
Okay. Now, if you go to your contemporaneous note and look at page 5, which is the second page of the narrative, which starts on page 4 under the timestamp of 0339. You see in the third entry down on page 5, as we passed CU7, I stepped on to take a short brief from Tom Goodall. He told me he had over 100 people involved in fire survival calls at his best estimate. Would it be right then that you got the 100 from him then?
I would think so, yes. But actually, it was very hard to get accurate information for quite a long time at the incident about overall numbers, because my sense every time I spoke to Tom was that they were changing constantly.
Yes.
And that it was hard actually to verify whether an original call that had come from the flat hadn't then been duplicated, because we had a conversation about the fact that people were moving, and it was very difficult to pin down whether or not that was a new call, a separate call, or whether it was the same group of people who had already called earlier, if that makes sense.
Yes, I see.
He was doing his absolute best in the face of very considerable volume of calls.
Yes. Just continuing with the timing. So you step onto the CU7 and get that information from him, as you just told us. Can I just ask you to look at MET 000 15705, 15705, which is a photograph. If we just swivel it round so we can see it. This is a photograph taken by DAC O'Loughlin on CU7, and you can see that at 3:47, so sometime after 3:39, which fits in your narrative, in your contemporaneous note at page 5, you can see that on the whiteboard there, and although it's not crystal clear from the picture, on the right-hand side, 3:47, 127 adults and 38 kids, which is, as we can see, quite a lot more than 100 are involved. It's 166. My question is, did Tom Goodall not give you that information?
No, I think I can remember that information, but what I do remember is a conversation about how the numbers didn't necessarily reflect the FSGs, because one FSG could incorporate any number of people, and also those people had potentially moved.
Right, I see. So what did you see that at that time, do you think, when you stepped onto CU7?
I can't say for certain I did.
Okay.
I know that I had a conversation with Tom Goodall, and he reflected that we had approximately 100 FSGs, and that he was trying to basically triangulate the information so we could get to a better place about the accuracy of it.
Yes, I see. Okay. Well, just help me with another picture. This is MET 0008735. And this is taken on CU... Well, let me ask you. That's not wrong. Do you recognise this whiteboard in this state?
I think that's not in the exact detail of it, but that is the board off CU8, I think.
Yes.
Yeah.
That was my next question, CU8. Now it says in the middle, just a little bit below the top, 0347 in black ink. Do you see?
I do.
And it says FS, I think it's FS something, FSG.
Yeah, it's FSG.
FSG 0347, 114 adults, 35 children, and then rescues 3 from flat 92. So that's 149 people in total. Did you see this board at that time, do you think?
I was constantly going back to the board, but I think what the board doesn't reflect is the constant requests by myself for information about FSGs, and trying to drive, as sensitively as I could, Tom to get into a place where we were accurately capturing the numbers.
Right.
That was very difficult throughout the evening. I felt that we were constantly fluctuating in terms of those numbers, and I never felt I got a complete handle on the numbers at any one time. I never had that confidence, because it just felt like the volume of calls coming in and the way it was changing, both because of people being rescued and coming out, probably the change of tasking to crews meant it was very hard, and callers coming off the line. So the fact that information was being held in so many places actually, it was really, really difficult to ever get to a definitive point. It was something, obviously, I wanted to know because, it tells you the story of the incident and how we were progressing those numbers.
Okay. I'm just going back then. We've seen the times of these totals, 3:47, on both CUs. And I've shown you the informative message going at 3:48 and 17 seconds on page 25 of the short incident log, which says approximately 100 individuals. Do you think that the message 100 individuals, approximately 100 individuals, was accurate?
I think that what it reflects is that we didn't have confidence in exact numbers, and it would have been wrong to put them into the informative message. So again, I'd like to reflect on a piece of experience in my past at the tram crash, where another agency had made a mistake about the numbers of fatalities and the numbers of persons involved. I think until you have that information with certainty, actually to place it on the record as a certainty is wrong, because I think that can be very damaging at a later date to survivors, families. I think what it says is the truth. It was approximately 100 people, because that felt about the scale of it, and it reflected a conversation I'd had with Tom. But I would be very reluctant to put a definitive figure into an informative message that is going to go into the record if I didn't know it to be entirely accurate. My great problem throughout that incident was that it was almost impossible to get with any degree of accuracy at any one moment in time where we were with the FSG calls because of the volume and the nature of continuous breathing apparatus rescue activity.
Yeah, and I've shown you two photographs from around 3:47. One showing that 166 persons were involved and one showing you that 149 persons were involved. My question is, would it not have been more accurate for those reading informative messages for you to have written or perhaps corrected the informative message to say approximately 150 rather than leaving it at 100, which might suggest understating the persons involved?
Could we just go back to the informative message so I can read the text of it? Would you mind? It's quite hard for me to answer that without seeing the text.
It's page 25 of the SIL, short incident log.
Thank you.
And it's 3:48:17 in the middle of the page.
Having shown me that information, I don't think it would be incorrect to say that that probably would have been a better approximation. But that is what I have recorded on the message at that point. I may well have had my reasons for that in terms of approving the message. But in terms of that wording, I would agree with that. I think 150 might have been more accurate at that point.
Right. Did that lead, or might that have led, to a tendency to understate the urgency or need for resourcing of this incident to people reading the log?
Absolutely not. People were under no illusions from the conversations I had with colleagues at a senior level, with Danny as the commissioner, that we were facing the most exceptional incident of our careers. To be frank, that just the 100 alone is still more FSG calls than we had experienced in the previous 10 years. It would absolutely not have affected the resourcing of the incident. At the height of the incident, I believe we had 75 appliances there in total, right. The largest single deployment of appliances since the Second World War. So, no.
Can I then just move you forward, same point, but move you forward in your log, and go please to page 5 in that log, which has a time mark of 5:50. Just below the top of the page. At this time, this is another TCM, middle of that first chunk, it says Tom running FSG, Tom Goodall FSG, 171 persons, 38 children and 133 adults from 45 flats, 58 persons from 21 flats P3. Against that background, can I then show you, so we can have perhaps both on at the same time, Paul, if we can put both up at the same time, page 33 of the short incident log, where at 6:48 we have another informative from you, 3/4 of the way down the page. Do you see? We can put both up at the same time. We can perhaps do this more easily, Mr. Ray. 6:48:43, and the informative message, as you can see, says CU8 from AC Row, residential block of 24 floors, etc. Approx 100 individuals involved. Now, just on that, it looks as if the 100 individuals involved hasn't changed at all since this informative message first went at 3:48, some 3 hours before 6:48, when we see this message. Putting the two pieces of information up on the screen, my question is, why did you send a message which said that there was approximately 100 individuals involved when you were told or about to be told that, in fact, it was up to 171?
I couldn't tell you, to be honest, Mr. Millett. So what I would reflect is that, you know, it may well have been more accurate to state that number as higher. I think I would accept that point, right, absolutely. Okay. But I don't think it changes the course of that incident, nor the nature of resourcing we placed on it. Right. And it may well be just a symptom of the fact that I was extremely busy, that the broad thrust of the message satisfied me, and that at that point it was used for internal information. And again, although, you know, that does seem very different from 0550, I'm not sure what the numbers were at 0648.
No, and to be fair to you, the message comes 2 minutes before the tactical coordination meeting. So the next question would be, well, having sent a message saying approximately 100, which stayed the same as it had for the last 3 hours, why didn't you then correct it after the 5:50 tactical coordination meeting to bring it up to date and show 171?
Isn't 0648 an hour later than the tactical coordination meeting you're referring to?
You're absolutely right. It certainly
is. So that's why I'm saying in that process of an hour, I'm not sure what would have changed. But actually, I would absolutely take your point. I think we probably could have reflected more accurately, but I would have had an anxiety about that, as I originally stated, because it was very difficult to ever get to an accurate number.
Yeah. Yes. I was being perhaps over fair to you, perhaps. But that's helpful. Now, can I then turn to the question of information flow regarding FSGs? In general, were you kept up to date of the FSG picture throughout the night?
Yes, I was. So I felt comfortable from the situational updates that Matt and Mick were giving me that I had an understanding of the general progress of FSG, notwithstanding the great difficulty in tying down the detail of it. Yes, I was, which was that we were continuously committing crews to the information we were receiving and were making progress. What I did at a later stage of the incident when Tom had the space to do it. So to begin with, Tom Goodall, I would not have wanted to take him off CU7. He was too busy. He was too fundamental to the operation of that FSG operation, you know, to that FSG system. But as we got further into the incident and it was clear that those numbers were reducing, I felt we were moving to a stage where we need to try and accurately capture and record within the decision log the numbers because, you know, tragically, we had to prepare ourselves for the fact we may be removing from rescuing survivors to recovery. And then I started to bring him into the unit to give me those numbers. Okay.
So the answer to my question is yes. And then what I want now to do is just to work out what if you can give us a shopping list of sources of information, we can run down those. Did you get up-to-date information from DAC O'Loughlin throughout the night?
Yes, I did. You did. Face-to-face and via Matt and Mick.
Right. And was that mainly at the hourly TCM meetings or separate from those?
No, both actually. So across the piece. So he both gave me a regular update face-to-face. Matt and Mick were constantly on and off the unit updating me. They were basically doing a cycle between the units, the tower and back. I think that's what they basically did all night.
Right. Did you get direct information from Tom Goodall on a regular basis about the progress of FSGs?
Via Matt and Mick to begin with, and then face-to-face within the TCMs, yes.
Face-to-face within the TCMs, right.
Yes.
And who gave briefings on FGS at the TCMs?
On FSG? I think Tom spoke about the numbers, from what I remember, because he held the numbers, and far better for him, because he's coming on with that information firsthand, to say it. So I would have turned to Tom as part of the progress of the meeting to say, Tom, could you now update all concerned with where we are with the fire survival guidance calls, the numbers of people that you think are involved?
Okay. Just going to the 5:50 TCM meeting at page 5 of your log, you see that you get a briefing from Tom Goodall there. We've looked at it before. Let's have it back again. Tom running FSG 171. Is that the kind of level of detail that you were getting?
In the TCM?
In the TCM meeting?
Yes.
Were you getting any greater level of detail outside the TCM meetings from Tom Goodall?
No, it was generally a reflection of where he was, that snapshot in time of how many calls they were having to handle, the general fact that information was going into the tower, but it was a constantly shifting picture. So I wasn't looking, in my position, I wasn't looking for a level of detail about individuals, where they were in flats. Really what I wanted desperately was for the number to reduce and the number of recorded rescues to increase. And that, again, was something I began to press more for as time went on, because I wanted to close that loop. That's how we ended up at the number of 65. We had someone sent out to try and triangulate that information, which was difficult to gather.
Yeah. Do you remember Tom Goodall giving you any other detailed information about precise figures of FSGs other than these?
I remember putting my head into CU7 and receiving a brief from Tom on a number of occasions where he told me where he thought he was at. And the accuracy of that information increased, obviously, as the incident went on, although there was never, complete confidence in the numbers because of the shifting nature of it. Otherwise, it was coming back in from primarily Mick, Matt, and when I was briefed by Andy O'Loughlin.
Right. Did you receive, during the course of the night, information about particular patterns of success or failure of deployments to particular floors?
Yes. So, but that was in the context of the progress of the BA operation as a whole. So it was more about where were we able to send BA crews to. So, I was very interested in how we were progressing up the building and what might prevent us from progressing further. And what got reflected back to me was that it kind of ebbed and flowed. So there were times where you thought you had taken control of a floor in terms of firefighting and had been able to progress past it, only then to find that the floor had again become involved very significantly in fire and crews were having to come back down through it. So that again had then shifted Pat and Richard's tactics to perhaps pull crews back a bit and then recommit to try and push further back upwards.
Right. So in that sort of macro sense, did you become aware at any time of difficulties getting above the 15th floor?
Yes, and not only the 15th floor, but other floors.
Okay, but we'll come to those. Let's just focus on the 15th floor. Do you remember when you were told about difficulties getting above the 15th floor?
No, I don't remember the time, no.
Right. We have some evidence that from one of the wall drawings, and we'll look at it, that it was about 425. But does that ring a bell?
It doesn't ring a bell, but I would have thought that's accurate if that's what's recorded.
Okay. What about the 11th floor as another candidate?
I remember having specific conversations about the 11th floor and the challenge of dealing with the 11th floor. The 11th floor seemed to become a problem, actually, in terms of fire spread and our people progressing beyond it. So the challenge of the BA operation, and I think it's worth focusing on the fact that that BA operation was entirely devoted to rescue. The only reason to firefight was to progress rescue. Not to control the fire, to extinguish it, but just to progress rescue operations. So when talking about progress of crews, that in my mind was inextricably linked to the rescue operation, not the ability to extinguish the fire. So that's why I needed to know the physical process, progress of crews. The 11th floor was certainly a problem.
Right.
I remember having a conversation, I think, with Pat Goldborn about progress.
And
beyond the 11th.
Do you remember roughly what time that was?
I don't, but it will be recorded because it would have been when I went inside the tower, because I never spoke to Pat or Richard except when I was in the tower.
Right. And do you remember what the particular problem was about getting above the 11th floor?
Yeah, the conditions on the 11th floor deteriorated to the extent that it was not possible to put firefighters into it. So I think what they described to me were basically unsustainable firefighting conditions. So an immense conflagration of heat, smoke, fire that made progress of the rescue operation almost impossible. So therefore they needed to resolve the firefighting situation on the 11th floor to be able to progress beyond it. But the 11th floor wasn't the only time that happened. We had a number of conversations throughout the night where this was happening on repeated occasions on different floors, sometimes in a way that surprised us. So thinking we'd work past a floor, only to find that the way the fire was behaving, it had come back down the building and was back underneath those crews, and we were having to pull back and repeat the process continuously to make progress.
Did you, when you received information about particular floors, rather than specific responses to FSG deployments, which I'll come back to. But in relation to flaws, did you then feed back or get somebody on the command unit to feed that back to control?
It's in terms of progress past the floors.
In terms of difficulty getting above particular floors?
I can't recollect whether I did.
Would it have been?
I would have liked to think I did, but I can't remember whether I did.
Would it? Yes. You say I would like to think I did. Is that because it was essential that control would know if they had callers above particular floors, which couldn't be accessed?
I think it has to be balanced actually with what you tell those callers, because actually that was rapidly changing. So I would be wary of telling someone that we weren't going to put any crews above the 11th floor when actually I was determined that we were going to put crews above the 11th floor. It was just a matter of time. So it was about, but I would acknowledge that that is useful information for control operators to have an understanding of progress within the building, yes.
Did you have a direct line of contact with the control room yourself?
I didn't, because they were so, I mean, my impression of control at that point was that they were at the point of being overwhelmed by the volume of calls. There was a direct line from an officer called Jason Olive into the FSG unit, and that was the direct link in. So their focus was on maintaining that operation, because that's what they were fully occupied with. I could have asked the command unit to pick up the phone to control, and we did have contact with control throughout the night, periodically. So it's not that there wouldn't have been a line of communication in, but in terms of a continuous line of communication, that would have been maintained rightly with the fire survival guidance sector.
Right. And am I right in thinking that it's not you personally who spoke to control, but the operator on CU7?
No, it would have been the operator on CU7 speaking into control. Yes.
Right. So when I say, so you personally didn't make any contact with control?
No, I wouldn't have picked the phone up to control or got onto the radio control myself personally.
Right.
No.
How were you, given that you were in CU8 and Tom Goodall was on CU7 and was that line of control, how did you monitor or continually observe the communications that he was having with control?
Because as part of the FSG system, that is part of Tom's brief to me about how the system was working and whether we were being able to maintain a complete throughput of information from control into the tower. I was assured that he had a continuous open line of communication into control. He had been clear about that, and at no point did I have any reason to believe that stopped, because the times I did see him, it was clear actually when I was on the unit, someone was continuously talking to control, and it was clear that information was passing because things were shifting all the time.
And in general terms, and we'll come to some specifics later on, but in general terms, were you aware that there was an absence of information coming back from the bridgehead about particular deployments in response to FSG calls to CU7?
I think generally I was aware of the fact that we were struggling to close the loop. Yes, I mean, it's the same as I responded yesterday, is that I knew that that was something we needed to improve on, and just struggled throughout the evening to close that loop.
Right. Are you happy to continue? I mean, we can or take a break now. I'm conscious that we do hourly rests.
If it's all right, I wouldn't mind 5 minutes if that's okay.
Yes, well, if that's what you like, of course we do. I mean, we're going to stop anyway. And,
sorry, I'm not aware of the time. Is it?
20, no, you can't see the clock, can
you?
No. It's 20 to 1. We normally stop for a break at 1 o'clock. We don't have to. We can stop at any time that seems convenient. So if you feel that it's time to have a break now, we can break and maybe take an early lunch and come back a bit early. Or if
Mr. Millet's in the flow of his questions, I'm happy to carry on till 1 o'clock for lunch. I am, yes.
Well, let's see if we can find a suitable point this side of 1 o'clock, should we?
Yes, certainly. Okay, that may be
but
possible.
if you feel the need for a break...
I'm fine, I just couldn't see the clock, I wasn't sure.
No, it's okay, I'm watching it. Now, 3:39. Can I take you to your, first of all, your log, the row log, page 2, where there is a reference at that time, site rep, sit rep, with Matt Cook. What's a sit rep?
So a situational update, so a brief to me.
Right. What's rep?
So a situational response.
Report.
So report, rather,
Right.
sorry. So situational report from Matt Cook.
Okay. Now, this is after the first TCM, as we can see. And it says there, Pat Goulbourne in Fire Sector carried out a tactical withdrawal of all BA and moved Bridgehead to ground floor. EDBA being committed to fourth floor for search and rescue firefighting. Make up for EDBA requested from PG. Now, just focusing on, first of all, you're being told that the Bridgehead had moved to the ground floor and EDBA being committed to the fourth floor for search and rescue. I just want to understand what you understood by that. Did that mean to you at the time that the entry control point was on the fourth floor, or that they could only get to the fourth floor at highest?
I understood that. That caused me great concern, actually,
Right.
that particular sit rep, because I felt it indicated a considerable worsening of conditions inside the tower. Actually, I needed to unpick why we were using EDBA that way, but I trusted Pat. I reasoned that he had a good reason for doing it, but actually I did need to unpick it, and I think it's after this point I went into the tower, so I really wanted to talk to Pat face-to-face about the use of EDBA and actually the fact we've moved the bridgehead and what that meant to progress.
Right. Did Pat come to the command unit to have this discussion with you, or was this something
No,
that
this
you were
was-
being told about by Matt?
This was relayed to me by Matt Cook.
Okay. So just going back to my question, was, to your understanding, was the entry control point on the fourth floor, or was the fourth floor the highest point which BA crews could get to at that point?
At that point, when I got told that, I wasn't clear. I wanted to understand exactly how EDBA was being used.
And what did you learn?
When we went inside, at the point I then did speak to Pat, it was that the bridgehead had moved to the ground floor and that we were committing crews from the ground floor upwards at that point was the information I then received, and that we were pushing our way back up the building. It had been a complete withdrawal because of conditions and then a push back into the building, but they progressed relatively quickly with that. I can't remember the exact floor they had got to.
Right. Can I just deviate slightly? This is a situation report with Matt Cook. Did it happen on the CU?
Yes.
And is that, we know that because it's been logged?
Yes.
Okay. And so do we take it that Jackie McConaughey, I think you said this yesterday, didn't go around the incident ground with you?
No.
So any discussion we see here is one that takes place on the CU?
Yes, so everything recorded here has taken place on the CU.
Okay. Now, at that point, you're still on the CU, and you're being told this by Matt Cook. Did you explore with him what he meant when he said EDBA being committed to fourth floor for search and rescue?
I can't remember the conversation in the detail at this point. What I do remember about that conversation is wanting to understand about the use of EDBA and how we were balancing the use of EDBA with SDBA, because EDBA is a very useful resource. Obviously, we have a limited amount of EDBA in London, and I wanted to know that we were using it in a way that made sense.
Right. Now, you say make up for EDBA, or Jackie records, make up for EDBA requested from PG. AR, I'm assuming that's you, update from LOC, reference EDBA resources. Just explain what you mean by what she means by update from LOC.
So I went back, I wanted an update from the London Operative Control, and because that's where the Brigade Coordination Centre, the BCC, was situated. I wanted to know where every single EDBA set in London was, including our reserves. So I know that we hold reserves at the Protective Equipment Group, kind of depot in Croydon. And the conclusion I was coming to is that I wanted every EDBA set in London and everyone who could competently wear an EDBA set to be at that incident.
Right. Did you or Matt Cook speak to Adrian Fenton in control about what extra EDBA was available in London?
I don't think I did personally. I don't know who did. But that update would have been requested in the context of my command unit staff. So someone's going to have gone and done it, and I would have expected some feedback about what the disposition was in terms of locations of EDBA, support pumps. So it's not just the FRUs that can wear EDBA, we have the support pumps as well. And I just wanted to understand exactly what we had left
Yeah.
to get them there.
Were you given to think at that point that there weren't enough EDBA present on the incident ground at that time?
No, that was the first I'd heard that Pat wanted more EDBA.
Right. Did you find out why?
I think when we went into the tower, I had an answer, yes, which was that we wanted EDBA because that was going to allow us to reach the highest points in the tower eventually. But even in the context of firefighting in the lower reaches of the tower, it enabled us to carry out tasks for a longer duration and could be used in that sense. But it was more, it's about the wear time, because that's what EDBA gives you.
Right.
So it gives you duration and reach, effectively, because of the duration.
Yes. And I think, just correct me if I'm wrong, is that what happens after this discussion is that you then go to the tower, because we see
Yes.
you do that after 3:39 in
Yes.
your contemporaneous note.
Yes.
Okay. We'll come to that. Just before we do, can I show you the short incident log, page 26? And I'd like to go to time mark 3:55:39 on page 26. Where, and it starts at the top of the page. It actually starts at the bottom of the previous page, but it doesn't matter. 3:55:39 user comment, and then there's a turning out message for EDBA. And that gets repeated. You can see down the page. In between the user comments, you can see turning out with message for EDBA, and it was repeated several times. And then ends up at 4:03 with a turning out message to attend with all EDBA sets available. Were those your requests? Or rather, sorry, did they come from you originally?
I think requests for EDBA happen from more than one place because, and I can't remember the exact sequence of it. I know that I wanted it and had left an instruction to get all EDBA at one point. I think Danny had also received some information and ordered all EDBA sets actually in London at one point.
Yes.
I think what we found was when we came back together that those two things had occurred.
Yes, and we'll no doubt explore this with her when she comes to give evidence. But it looks as if she actually also made a command decision that there be more EDBA found. We can see that actually in the incident log, your row log rather, at 3:58. It's just below 3:39. It's page 2 of the log. All EDBA and brigade to be ordered to the incident. That comes from the commissioner. So you recall that. You'd left the CU by then, I think, had you?
Yeah, I had.
Right. Okay. So looking at the turning out messages to attend with all EDBA sets available, which I showed you on the short incident log, were those your messages?
I can't recollect.
All right. Did you think at that stage that there was a deficit in the supply of EDBA?
It wasn't necessarily I thought there was a deficit, but what I did anticipate, having heard that, was that we were going to need to make greater use of EDBA. And actually, we were so close to having nearly all of the EDBA in London there anyway. I just factored in that actually, if at this stage of the incident, Pat was making the request, we should factor forward that we were going to reasonably make use of all of the EDBA available to us. And therefore, I would want that.
Just a couple of detailed points. Do you recall a problem with there being telemetry batteries being flat on EDBA supplied cylinders?
I only learnt that after the incident.
Right. You didn't know it during the incident?
No, I didn't know it during the incident.
Okay. Do you recall whether there was a problem with the BA covers not being available for some of the cylinders?
Not during the incident, but post-incident, I learnt that. And my understanding is these were the reserve sets that came from the Protective Equipment Group depot in Croydon.
Right.
But I didn't know at the time of the incident, no.
Okay. So as far as you're concerned, neither of those caused you or anybody else a problem, is that?
In the context of maintaining a continuous breathing apparatus operation, no.
Right. Did it cause any specific problems?
Because I wasn't aware of it, no, I'm not aware that it did.
Right. Mr. Chairman, I think that is a convenient moment. I'm going to move to something else.
Right.
Move on, I suppose. On in the story.
Give me some help. How are we getting on?
We're getting on okay.
Well, I'm sure we are, Mr. Millett, but I was really wondering whether we could say 2 o'clock rather than 10.
We can say 2 o'clock.
Yes, all right. Well, we will break there. Mr. Rowan, have a slightly longer than usual lunch break. Please don't talk to anyone about your evidence while you're out of the room. And we'll resume at 2 o'clock, please.
Thank you, sir.
All right. Thank you very much. You go with the usher then. Thank you. Thank you. 2 o'clock, please.